I showed up to my wife's law firm opening party only to see everyone laughing and pointing. Testrin husband eyes here. Then my wife handed me an envelope. The first job of my firm, our divorce, sign and leave. So I walked away quietly, canceled every payment, party, trip, and pulled out my $20 million investment to her firm. Minutes later, my phone lit up with 456 missed calls, and someone showed up at my door. Chapter 1. Michael Anderson came into this world on a frigid January morning in a tiny town called Millbrook, Ohio, where factory smokestacks dominated the skyline and most families lived paycheck to paycheck, never quite making it to the next week without worry. His father worked at the steel mill, coming home each night with hands blackened by industrial grime and a back that bent a little more with each passing year, while his mother cleaned houses for the wealthy families on the hill, the ones who lived in homes with columns and circular driveways and hedges trimmed into perfect shapes. Michael was the youngest of 3 boys, and from his earliest memories he understood that money was something other people had, something that determined whether you ate name-brand cereal or the store version that came in bags, whether you wore new shoes or ones passed down from your brothers with holes covered by cardboard inserts. The Anderson family lived in a 2-bedroom house with siding that was more rust than paint, where winter winds whistled through gaps in the windows and summer heat turned the upstairs into an oven, where the bathroom had a crack in the mirror that made everyone look broken, and the kitchen table wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others. But despite the poverty, despite the constant struggle, Michael's parents taught him something more valuable than money could ever buy. They taught him that dignity wasn't about what you owned, but about how you carried yourself. That respect was earned through actions, not inherited through circumstances, and that if you wanted something badly enough and were willing to work harder than everyone else, you could change your entire story. Michael was 7 years old when he started his first business, though calling it a business was perhaps generous. He collected bottles and cans from neighbors, from ditches along the highway, from trash bins behind restaurants, spending entire Saturdays filling garbage bags with anything that had a 5-cent deposit, his small hands getting sticky with old soda residue and his shoes getting soaked crossing through drainage ditches. He would drag those bags to the recycling center on his wagon, a red radio flyer that had belonged to his oldest brother and had one wheel that squeaked with every rotation, and he would stand on his tiptoes to pour the cans into the machine, watching the counter climb penny by penny, while the attendants smiled at his determination. Most kids his age spent their weekends playing, but Michael spent his collecting cans, and by the end of that first summer he had saved $83, which he kept in a coffee can hidden under his bed, checking it every night before sleep like a dragon guarding treasure. His mother cried when he used that money to buy groceries one week, when his father's hours had been cut. And though Michael pretended not to notice her tears, something settled deep in his chest that day, a knowledge that money wasn't just paper and coins but freedom, security, the ability to help the people you loved. And he swore to himself that he would never be poor again, that he would find a way to climb out of the hole circumstances had dug for his family. School came easy to Michael in some ways, and brutally hard in others. He was naturally good with numbers, able to see patterns and solutions while other kids were still counting on their fingers, and his teachers noticed that he had a mind built for logic and problem solving, the kind of mind that could take complex information and break it down into understandable pieces. But reading was a battle, words swimming on the page and letters flipping themselves around until he wanted to throw the book across the room, and it wasn't until 3rd grade that a patient teacher named Mrs. Henderson realized he had dyslexia and started working with him after school, teaching him strategies to slow down and focus, to use colored overlays and finger tracking, to be patient with himself instead of angry at his brain for working differently. Michael would stay after school 3 days a week working with Mrs. Henderson, missing the bus and having to walk the 2 miles home in whatever weather the Ohio seasons threw at him. But he didn't complain because he understood that education was a ladder and he intended to climb every single rung, no matter how much his hands ached from holding on. By 5th grade he was reading at grade level, and by 7th grade he was reading above it, devouring books about business and success, about people who had started with nothing and built empires, about failures that became stepping stones and setbacks that became setups for comebacks. He read about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, about Oprah and Warren Buffett, about immigrants who came to America with empty pockets and determination that couldn't be measured, and each story fed the fire burning. Inside him, the absolute certainty that he would not live and die in Millbrook, that he would not spend 40 years in a factory, that he was destined for something more, even if nobody else could see it yet. When Michael was 13, his father was injured at the mill, a piece of machinery malfunctioning and crushing 3 fingers on his left hand. And though the company paid medical bills, they didn't pay enough to cover the mortgage and food and everything else a family of 5 needed. Michael watched his father try to work with a bandaged hand, watched him wince with pain every time he gripped something, watched the worry lines deepen around his mother's eyes as she picked up extra houses to clean, and he decided right then that waiting until he was an adult to start making money was a luxury his family couldn't afford. He started mowing lawns in the wealthy neighborhood where his mother worked, knocking on doors with a confidence he didn't quite feel, offering to mow and edge and trim for prices lower than the established lawn companies charged, promising quality work and reliability. Most people said no, but eventually a woman named Mrs. Patterson took a chance on him, more out of pity than belief, and Michael showed up at 6 in the morning on Saturday with a mower he'd borrowed from a neighbor, and worked until every blade of grass was perfect, until the edges were sharp enough to cut paper, until her yard looked like something from a magazine. Mrs. Patterson was so impressed she told her friends, and her friends hired him, and by the end of that summer Michael had 20 regular clients, and was making more money than he'd ever imagined possible for a 13-year-old, enough to help with bills and buy his own school clothes, and start saving again in a new coffee can that was quickly becoming too small for his ambitions. High school brought new challenges and new opportunities, and Michael navigated both with a focus that made him seem older than his years. He continued his lawn business, expanding to include snow removal in winter and gutter cleaning in fall, building a reputation as the kid who showed up on time, who did exactly what he promised, who treated every job like it mattered because to him it did. His grades were good, not perfect but solid, and he joined the math club and business club, spending lunch periods talking with teachers about investment strategies and compound interest, and the power of starting young. While his classmates were concerned with football games and school dances, Michael was reading financial books and studying successful entrepreneurs, teaching himself about real estate and stocks and business models, filling notebooks with ideas and plans and calculations about how much he would need to save, how much he would need to invest, what percentage of return would get him where he wanted to go. His brothers thought he was weird, his classmates thought he was boring, but Michael didn't care what they thought because he could see a future they couldn't imagine, a life where he wasn't trapped by circumstances, where he made the rules instead of following ones set by people who had never wanted anything more than a steady paycheck and a pension. He knew he was different, knew he wanted things other people didn't even know were possible, and instead of trying to fit in, he leaned into his difference, understanding that normal people got normal results, and he was aiming for something far beyond normal. The summer before his senior year, Michael's lawn business had grown large enough that he couldn't handle all the work himself, so he hired 2 classmates to help him, paying them fair wages and teaching them his standards, explaining that their work reflected on his reputation, and his reputation was everything. This was his first experience managing people, and he learned quickly that leadership wasn't about being bossy but about clear communication, about setting expectations and providing the tools to meet them, about recognizing good work and correcting poor work without destroying motivation. He discovered he was good at seeing people's strengths and positioning them where they could succeed, that he had a natural ability to inspire others to care about quality even when he wasn't watching, and these skills would serve him far beyond cutting grass and shoveling snow. By the time he graduated high school, Michael had saved $32,000, a sum that seemed impossible to his parents, who had never had more than a few $100s in savings at any point in their lives. His guidance counselor pushed him to apply to colleges, showing him scholarship applications and explaining that his grades and unique background could open doors. But Michael had already decided that traditional college wasn't his path, that 4 years sitting in classrooms learning theory wasn't what he needed, that he wanted to be in the real world building actual businesses and making actual money while his peers accumulated debt and degrees that might or might not lead to jobs. This decision disappointed his parents, who had hoped one of their sons would be the first to go to college. But Michael explained his plan with such clarity and confidence that eventually they understood. Eventually they saw that he had a vision most 18-year-olds couldn't articulate. And they gave him their blessing, even though they didn't fully understand where he was going. Chapter 2. Michael's first real business venture started in a rented garage on the outskirts of Millbrook, a cramped space that smelled like motor oil and had electrical outlets that sparked occasionally but cost only $200 a month, which was what he could afford. He had spent months researching different business models, analyzing what products and services people needed, what margins were realistic, what could be started with limited capital, and he had settled on something that seemed almost too simple. He would flip furniture. Not fancy antiques or designer pieces, but regular furniture that people were throwing away or selling. Cheap because it was damaged or outdated, furniture he could repair and refinish and sell for profit. He started by driving around on trash days in wealthy neighborhoods, loading dressers and tables and chairs with broken legs or scratched surfaces into a truck he'd bought for $1,500, a vehicle that was more rust than metal but ran well enough to get him where he needed to go. He taught himself furniture repair through YouTube videos and library books, learning to strip old paint, fix broken joints, replace missing hardware, refinish wood until it glowed like new. His garage became a workshop, filled with sandpaper and stain and polyurethane, with clamps and wood glue and replacement parts, with furniture in various states of transformation. And Michael would work from early morning until late at night, his hands covered in sawdust and his lungs filled with the smell of varnish, completely focused on turning trash into treasure. The first piece he sold was a dining table he'd found on the curb, a solid oak table that had been beautiful once, but was covered in scratches and water rings and had a wobbly leg. Michael spent 2 weeks on that table, stripping it down to bare wood, sanding it smooth, repairing the leg, applying new stain and multiple coats of protective finish, and when he was done, it looked like something from a high-end furniture store, like something that should cost thousands of dollars. He listed it online for $400, holding his breath and hoping someone would see the value, and it sold within 6 hours to a young couple furnishing their first house. They were thrilled with the quality and the price, and Michael was thrilled with the profit, having invested maybe $50 in materials and a lot of sweat equity into a piece that had returned $400. This was the proof of concept he needed, the confirmation that his business model worked, and he immediately scaled up, finding more furniture, working faster, improving his techniques, learning what styles sold quickly and what could sit for weeks without interest. Within 3 months he was making more money than most adults in Millbrook, and within 6 months he had hired his first employee, a retired carpenter named Frank, who taught Michael advanced techniques and helped increase production, who treated the young entrepreneur with respect most people reserved for those twice his age. But Michael wasn't content to just flip furniture forever, wasn't satisfied with a business that required his constant physical labor, that would always be limited by how many hours he could work and how many pieces he could personally restore. He started thinking about scalability, about how to build something that could grow beyond him. And he realized that the real opportunity wasn't in doing the work himself but in creating a system where others did the work. He began hiring more people, training them in his methods, setting up multiple workstations in a larger warehouse space he rented, creating an assembly line approach where each person specialized in one part of the process instead of doing everything. One person would do pickup and delivery, another would handle repairs, another would focus on refinishing, another would manage photography and listings, and Michael would oversee everything, ensuring quality and managing the business side. This shift from worker to manager, from technician to entrepreneur, was crucial in Michael's development, teaching him that the business owner's job wasn't to do everything but to build systems and develop people who could do everything, that his highest value wasn't in wielding a paintbrush, but in making decisions and creating processes and identifying opportunities. The business grew rapidly under this new model, expanding from furniture to include appliances and electronics and anything else people threw away that could be repaired and resold, and by the time Michael was 21, he had 15 employees and was clearing $10,000 a month in profit, putting most of it into savings and investments, still living in a small apartment and driving his rusty truck because he understood that money spent on lifestyle was money that couldn't work for him. It was during this period of rapid business growth that Michael first encountered the world of real estate investing, a world that would eventually make him wealthy beyond anything furniture flipping could achieve. One of his employees, an older man named Roger who did pickup and delivery, mentioned that he owned a few rental properties and made decent money without doing much work, just collecting rent checks and handling occasional maintenance. And this concept fascinated Michael because it represented the ultimate form of scalability, the idea that you could buy something once and it would generate income month after month, year after year, building wealth while you slept. He started researching real estate investing with the same intensity he had brought to every previous endeavor, reading every book he could find, listening to podcasts during his commute, joining online forums where investors shared strategies and mistakes, learning about house hacking, and the BRRRR method, and creative financing, and all the ways people built wealth through property. He learned that real estate was how most millionaires made their money, that it provided tax benefits and appreciation and cash flow and leverage, that you could control a $300,000 asset with a $60,000 down payment, and have tenants pay off the mortgage while the property increased in value. The more Michael learned, the more convinced he became that real estate was his path to serious wealth, and he started saving aggressively for his first investment property, cutting his already minimal personal expenses even further, eating ramen for dinner and canceling the cable he barely watched. Every dollar sacred because every dollar was a brick in the empire he was building. Michael's first investment property was a duplex in a working-class neighborhood, a property that needed significant work but was priced accordingly, listed at $80,000 when similar properties in good condition were selling for $130,000. He put $20,000 down, borrowed the rest, and immediately began renovations, doing much of the work himself to save money, using skills he'd developed, flipping furniture to repair cabinets and refinish floors, hiring out only the specialized work like plumbing and electrical that required licensed professionals. He worked on that duplex every evening after managing his furniture business all day, worked through weekends and holidays, driven by a vision of what it could become and what it represented for his future. After 3 months and $15,000 in materials and contracted labor, the duplex was transformed, looking better than it probably had at any point in its 50-year history, with updated kitchens and bathrooms, with fresh paint and new carpet, with modern fixtures and curb appeal that made it stand out on the block. He rented both units within a week, charging $800 per side, bringing in $1,600 monthly against a mortgage payment of $600, leaving him with $1,000 a month in cash flow after setting aside money for maintenance and vacancies. But the real beauty was that the property had cost him $35,000 all in, and after renovations it was worth approximately $130,000, meaning he had created $95,000 in equity, in paper wealth, in net worth. And he still owned the asset, still collected the rent, still benefited from appreciation. This experience was transformative for Michael, opening his eyes to the power of leverage and forced appreciation, and strategic value-add investing, and he immediately started looking for his next property. Over the next 3 years, Michael bought 7 more properties using a combination of the cash flow from his furniture business, the equity from previous properties through refinancing, and creative financing strategies like seller financing, and private money from individuals who wanted better returns than banks offered. He became known in local real estate circles as a young investor who moved fast and closed deals, who could evaluate a property quickly and make competitive offers, who had both the capital and the capability to execute renovations efficiently. Each property he bought was a value-add opportunity, something that needed work but had good bones and was in a decent location, and each property he renovated and rented added to his monthly cash flow and overall net worth. By the time he was 24, Michael owned 8 rental properties worth over $1 million combined, with enough cash flow to cover all his expenses and then some, meaning he had achieved what few people reach in their entire lives: financial independence, the ability to live without depending on active income, the freedom to choose what he did with his time because his assets worked for him instead of him working for survival. But Michael wasn't satisfied with financial independence, wasn't content to retire at 24 and live modestly off rental income because his vision was bigger than comfort, bigger than security, bigger than the small-town success that would have made his parents proud. He wanted wealth, real wealth, the kind that changed lives and created opportunities and made an impact, and he knew that meant continuing to push, continuing to take calculated risks, continuing to build something extraordinary. Chapter 3. Michael met Victoria Hayes on a rainy Tuesday evening at a coffee shop near the university, a upscale place with exposed brick walls and baristas who took their craft seriously, the kind of place Michael rarely visited because he saw expensive coffee as an unnecessary luxury. But he was meeting a potential private lender there, someone who had been referred by another investor, and he arrived 15 minutes early because punctuality was a form of respect, and first impressions mattered. He ordered a basic black coffee and sat near the window watching rain streak down the glass, reviewing property numbers on his laptop, so focused on spreadsheets that he didn't notice the woman sitting at the next table until she spoke, her voice cutting through his concentration like a bell in a quiet room. She asked if he knew anything about real estate, explaining that she couldn't help but notice his screen full of property data, and she was actually considering buying her first home but felt overwhelmed by the process. And when Michael looked up to answer her, his breath caught because she was stunning, not just attractive but luminous, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold secrets and a smile that made the rainy evening feel suddenly bright. They started talking and the minutes flew by, his lender meeting forgotten, Victoria explaining that she was in law school at the university, in her second year and already exhausted by the workload, but determined to finish. Determined to become a lawyer because she came from a family where nobody had gone to college and she wanted to prove that someone from her background could succeed in a profession dominated by people born into privilege. Michael felt an immediate connection to Victoria, a recognition that they were similar in fundamental ways, both fighters who refused to accept the limitations of their origins, both ambitious and driven, and willing to sacrifice comfort for future success. She told him about growing up in a small apartment with 3 siblings, about a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who left when she was young, about getting scholarships and loans to pay for school because her family couldn't help financially, about the pressure of being the hope of her entire family, the one who was supposed to make it, supposed to break the cycle. Michael shared his own story, told her about Millbrook and the steel mill and collecting cans as a kid, about building his business from nothing and teaching himself real estate investing, and Victoria listened with an intensity that made him feel seen in a way he rarely experienced, like she understood not just the words but the emotions behind them, the hunger and the fear and the determination. They talked for 3 hours that first night, long after Michael's lender had texted to cancel and the coffee shop staff started giving them looks that suggested they wanted to close, and when they finally exchanged numbers and said goodbye, Michael walked to his truck feeling like something significant had happened. Like he had met someone who could be important, who could be a partner in more than just the romantic sense. He drove home through rain that had softened to mist, thinking about Victoria's laugh and her intelligence and the way she talked about the future with the same certainty he felt, and he went to sleep that night with a smile on his face and hope in his chest. Their relationship developed quickly, with an intensity that felt inevitable, rather than rushed, like 2 rivers that were always meant to merge. They started meeting regularly at that same coffee shop, comparing schedules that were both packed with obligations, Michael managing his businesses and properties, Victoria juggling law school classes and part-time work at a law firm, and study groups that lasted until midnight. But despite their busy lives, they made time for each other, carved out hours that belonged only to them, and those hours became the best part of both their days. Michael would pick Victoria up after her evening classes, and they would drive around looking at properties, Michael pointing out what made something a good investment or a bad one, Victoria asking smart questions that showed she was genuinely interested, rather than just being polite. Victoria would invite Michael to her tiny apartment and cook dinner while he sat at her kitchen counter telling her about deals he was working on and problems he was solving, and she would offer perspectives he hadn't considered, would play devil's advocate and poke holes in his plans, making him sharper and more thoughtful. They challenged each other, pushed each other, made each other better, and the attraction between them was electric, the kind of chemistry that made every touch feel significant, and every kiss feel like a promise. Within 3 months they were inseparable, within 6 months they had said I love you. And within a year Michael was certain that Victoria was the person he wanted to build a life with, that she was his match in every way that mattered. Michael's friends, the few he had because he spent most of his time working, warned him that he was moving too fast. That a year wasn't long enough to really know someone, that successful people attracted partners who wanted their success rather than them, but Michael dismissed these concerns because they came from people who hadn't met Victoria, who hadn't seen how she was with him when there was nothing to gain, who hadn't witnessed her ambition that matched his own. Victoria wasn't impressed by his money or his properties. In fact, she often pushed back when Michael wanted to spend money on her, insisting on paying her own way, on maintaining her independence, on not being anyone's charity case or trophy girlfriend. She had her own dreams and her own drive, was building her own future, and she talked about being a partner in a relationship, not a dependent, about building something together, rather than one person supporting the other. This attitude made Michael love her more, made him respect her more, made him believe they could be the power couple he had always imagined, both successful in their own right, both contributors to a shared empire. He started including Victoria in his business planning, sharing his goals and his strategies, and she started including him in her career planning, talking about what kind of law she wanted to practice and what kind of firm she wanted to join and eventually how she might start her own practice someday. They would lie in bed late at night making plans that stretched years into the future, plans that always included both of them. Plans built on the assumption that they were in this together, that it was Michael and Victoria against the world. And Michael had never felt more certain about anything than he felt about her. When Victoria graduated from law school, finishing in the top 15% of her class despite working part-time throughout and having no family support, Michael was in the audience cheering, louder than anyone else, pride swelling in his chest because he knew how hard she had worked, how many nights she had stayed up studying, how many times she had wanted to quit but pushed through. He had helped where he could, had quizzed her before exams, and brought her food during study marathons and listened when she needed to vent about professors or classmates or the crushing pressure of it all. But the achievement was hers, the degree was hers, the success was hers, and he never wanted her to forget that. After graduation came the bar exam, 2 months of intensive studying that consumed Victoria completely, and Michael supported her through it, took on extra work so she could focus, made sure she had everything she needed, celebrated with her when she passed on the first try, which only 65% of test takers managed to do. Victoria accepted a position at a mid-size firm in the city, an hour commute from where they were living, but a good opportunity with mentorship from experienced lawyers and a path to partnership if she worked hard enough. And though the hours were brutal and the work was demanding, Victoria thrived, quickly establishing herself as someone reliable and sharp and willing to do whatever it took. Michael watched her transform from a law student to a lawyer, watched her confidence grow and her skills sharpen, and he fell more in love with her success, with her determination, with the woman she was becoming, never suspecting that the same ambition he admired would eventually be turned against him like a weapon he had handed her himself. After 2 years of dating, Michael decided it was time to propose, not because he felt pressured by timelines or traditions, but because he couldn't imagine a future that didn't include Victoria, because she had become so integral to his life that her absence was unthinkable. He planned an elaborate proposal, renting out the rooftop of a downtown building that overlooked the city, arranging for flowers and candles and a photographer to capture the moment, sparing no expense, because this was the most important question he would ever ask. But when the evening came, and they stood on that rooftop with the city lights spreading out below them like stars fallen to earth, Michael's elaborate plan fell away, and he simply dropped to one knee and spoke from his heart, told Victoria that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, that she made him want to be better, that he wanted to spend every day of the rest of his life making her as happy as she made him, and he asked her to marry him with a voice that shook with emotion. Victoria said yes with tears streaming down her face, said yes with a certainty that matched his own, and they held each other on that rooftop while the photographer captured images of two people who believed they had found forever, who thought they were writing a love story instead of the first chapter of a tragedy. The ring Michael gave her was substantial, a 2-carat diamond that represented 3 months of his income as tradition suggested, and Victoria gasped when she saw it, told him it was too much, but Michael insisted because he wanted the world to know she was claimed, was loved, was valued, wanted a symbol on her finger that reflected how he felt inside. They set the wedding date for the following spring, wanting time to plan something special, and they threw themselves into preparations with the same intensity they brought to everything else, choosing venues and caterers and flowers, blending their different visions into something that represented both of them, excited about the celebration but more excited about the marriage itself, about officially being partners in every sense, about building their future together. Chapter 4. The wedding took place on a perfect April afternoon in a garden venue with blooming flowers and gentle sunshine, the kind of day that felt like a blessing, like nature itself was celebrating their union. Michael stood at the altar in a tailored suit, watching Victoria walk down the aisle and thought his heart might explode from happiness, from the sheer overwhelming emotion of seeing the woman he loved moving toward him to promise forever, her dress white and flowing and perfect, her smile radiant and real, tears in her eyes that matched the tears in his. The ceremony was beautiful and personal, with vows they had written themselves, words about partnership and support and choosing each other every day, words that felt sacred and true, words that everyone witnessing believed came from the depths of their souls. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife and they kissed while everyone cheered, Michael felt complete in a way he never had before felt. Like all the hard work and all the sacrifice and all the years of building had led to this moment, had led to this person, and everything made sense. The reception was a celebration that stretched into the night, with dinner and dancing and toasts from friends and family, with Michael's parents crying tears of joy because their youngest son had found love and success, with Victoria's mother holding Michael's hand and thanking him for loving her daughter so well, with everyone who mattered gathered in one place to witness the joining of two people who seemed destined for extraordinary things together. The first year of marriage was an adjustment, as all first years are, learning to share space and compromise on decisions and navigate the small irritations that come with constant proximity, but overall it was happy, filled with more good moments than bad, more laughter than arguments, more love than frustration. Michael's real estate portfolio continued growing, now 14 properties with plans to hit 20 by year's end, and his other business ventures were thriving as well, including a property management company he had started to manage his own rentals that was now managing properties for other investors too, charging fees and building another income stream. Victoria was excelling at her law firm, taking on bigger cases and more responsibility, getting noticed by partners and building a reputation as someone who prepared meticulously and performed exceptionally, someone who could be trusted with important clients and complex matters. They bought a house together, a beautiful 4-bedroom in a good neighborhood, nothing ostentatious but certainly comfortable. A place they could see raising children someday, and they filled it with furniture and memories and dreams. They would sit on their back patio on weekend mornings drinking coffee and reading the paper. Michael reviewing property listings and Victoria reviewing case files, comfortable in silence, happy in each other's presence, and Michael would look at her and think how lucky he was, how grateful, how certain he had been right about her, about them, about forever. But there were moments, small moments that Michael noticed but dismissed because he wanted everything to be perfect, when Victoria seemed distant or distracted, when she would snap at him over nothing and then apologize quickly, when she would work late more often than seemed necessary or take phone calls in another room speaking in hushed tones. Michael told himself she was stressed from work, that law firms were demanding and partnership track was brutal, that everyone had moods and moments of irritation, and it didn't mean anything fundamental was wrong. Victoria assured him everything was fine when he asked, would kiss him and smile and tell him not to worry. would say she was just tired or had a difficult case or was dealing with firm politics, and Michael believed her because he wanted to believe her. Because doubt felt like betrayal, because questioning his wife felt like admitting his judgment had been wrong, and he had built his entire life on trusting his judgment. So he pushed the worry down, focused on his businesses, on making more money, on building security for their future, telling himself that his job was to provide and protect and support, that if Victoria was struggling, the solution was for him to be more successful, to take stress off her by ensuring their financial foundation was rock solid. He worked harder, closed more deals, expanded faster, all in service of a vision where Victoria could eventually stop working if she wanted, could start her own firm with his backing, could have every option available, because he had built enough wealth to make anything possible. By their second anniversary, Michael's net worth had crossed $5 million, a milestone that seemed surreal to a kid who had once collected cans for nickels, and he celebrated by surprising Victoria with a trip to Paris, first-class tickets, and a suite at a five-star hotel and reservations at restaurants where you needed to book months in advance. Victoria seemed thrilled with the surprise, posted pictures on social media of them in front of the Eiffel Tower and at sidewalk cafes and walking along the Seine, pictures that showed a happy couple living a dream life, and everyone who saw those pictures thought they were perfect together, thought they had it all figured out, thought they were relationship goals. But during that trip, there were moments when Michael caught Victoria looking at him strangely, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between calculation and dissatisfaction. Something that made him uncomfortable, even though he couldn't articulate why. When he asked if something was wrong, she would smile and say everything was perfect, would kiss him and hold his hand, and say she was just taking it all in, and Michael would accept the explanation because the alternative was terrifying, was admitting that maybe he didn't know his wife as well as he thought, maybe there were parts of her she kept hidden. Maybe the person he married was becoming someone else, or had always been someone else, and he was just now seeing it. Victoria started talking more frequently about wanting to start her own law firm, about being tired of working for partners who took most of the profit while she did most of the work, about having her own vision for how a firm should be run, about building something that was hers, rather than climbing a ladder someone else had built. Michael encouraged this dream, told her he would support her however she needed, financially or emotionally or practically, told her that his success was meant to enable her success, that they were partners, and her dreams were his dreams. They started planning in earnest, talking about timelines and budgets and business models, about what kind of law she wanted to practice and what kind of clients she wanted to serve, about office space and hiring and marketing, and all the million details that go into starting a business. Victoria came alive during these planning sessions in a way Michael hadn't seen since law school, animated and excited and full of ideas, and he loved seeing her like this. Loved feeling like he was contributing to something important to her, loved imagining them both as business owners, both entrepreneurs, both builders of their own empires. He offered to invest in her firm, offered a substantial amount to get it started right, to skip the struggling startup phase and launch with enough capital to be competitive. And Victoria accepted, with what seemed like genuine gratitude, with hugs and kisses and promises that she wouldn't let him down, that this was going to be amazing, that they were going to build something incredible together. Over the next year, Michael invested increasingly large amounts into Victoria's planned law firm, money for office space and furniture, and technology and hiring and marketing, and 1,000 other things that apparently cost more than he had anticipated. Victoria handled all the planning, said she wanted to surprise him with the final result. Wanted him to walk in on opening day and see what she had built, and Michael trusted her completely, wrote checks without question, transferred money whenever she asked because he believed in her vision and her capability and their partnership. He was busy with his own businesses anyway, acquiring 3 more properties and launching a construction company that handled renovations for his properties and was now taking outside clients, and he was happy to let Victoria run her firm's startup while he ran his ventures, both of them working toward their individual successes that would combine into their shared success. Victoria's demeanor changed during this period, becoming more confident and also more distant, spending long hours allegedly working on firm setup, coming home late and exhausted, sometimes not coming home until the next morning, claiming she had fallen asleep at the office or stayed at a hotel near the office to save commute time. Michael didn't love this arrangement, but he understood it, remembered his own early business days when he practically lived at work, when building something from nothing required everything you had, and he supported her even when he missed her, even when their house felt empty, even when he ate dinner alone more often than together, because he believed this was temporary, believed that once the firm launched things would normalize, believed the sacrifice now would lead to happiness later. Chapter 5. The invitation came on a Tuesday in October, delivered to their house in an expensive envelope with embossed lettering, formal and impressive like everything Victoria did. It announced the grand opening of Hayes Law Group, Victoria's firm, scheduled for the following Saturday evening, a celebration to mark the official launch and introduce the firm to potential clients and referral sources and the legal community. Michael felt a surge of pride reading the invitation, seeing his wife's name in elegant script, knowing that all her hard work and his financial support had led to this moment, that she was achieving the dream she had talked about for years. Victoria seemed excited but also nervous when they discussed it, said she wanted everything to be perfect, said this night would set the tone for the firm's future, said she had invited everyone who mattered in the local legal world plus friends and family, probably 150 people total. Michael offered to help with planning or setup, but Victoria insisted she had it under control, said she had hired an event planner and everything was arranged, said all he needed to do was show up looking handsome and proud, be the supportive husband celebrating his wife's achievement. He asked what he should wear, and she suggested his best suit, said this was a black tie optional event, so people would be dressed formally, said she wanted everyone to see them as the power couple they were, successful and sophisticated and impressive. Michael went shopping for a new suit, picked something expensive and perfectly tailored, wanted to look like he belonged next to Victoria, wanted to make her proud the way she made him proud. The week leading up to the opening, Victoria was gone almost entirely, claimed she was handling last-minute details and meeting with potential clients and making sure everything was perfect. Michael barely saw her, would come home to an empty house and wake up to an empty bed, and while he missed her he also understood, remembered his own business launches and how consuming they were, how every detail felt crucial and every decision felt weighted. He sent her encouraging texts that she responded to with brief thank yous, tried calling but she rarely answered, and when she did she sounded stressed and distracted, asked him to trust that everything would be worth it, that after Saturday they could relax and enjoy the success together. Michael counted down the days, excited to see what Victoria had built, excited to celebrate with her, excited to move past this intense startup phase into something more sustainable and balanced. He imagined walking into the firm with her, meeting the people she had hired, seeing the office space she had designed, shaking hands with potential clients and referral sources, being introduced as Victoria's husband and business partner, because even though he wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations, his investment made him a partner in her success, his support had made this possible, and he was proud of that, proud of her, proud of them. Saturday arrived with perfect autumn weather, cool and clear with leaves turning gold and red. The kind of day that felt significant, like nature was cooperating with important events. Michael spent the morning working out, and the afternoon getting ready, showering and shaving carefully and putting on his new suit, looking at himself in the mirror and seeing a man who had come far from collecting cans in Millbrook, a man who had built something from nothing, a man whose wife was launching her own law firm partly because he had made it financially possible, and he felt good, felt successful, felt like he had earned his place in the world. Victoria had stayed at a hotel near the office the night before, texted that morning to say she was handling final preparations and would see him at the party, told him to arrive at 7 o'clock sharp, said she loved him and couldn't wait to celebrate together. Michael arrived at the office building at 6:55, always punctual, and stood outside for a moment looking at the building, impressive and modern with glass and steel, the kind of place that screams success and professionalism. The building directory showed Hayes Law Group on the 3rd floor, and Michael rode the elevator up feeling anticipation build in his chest, excitement about seeing Victoria's vision realized, about celebrating this milestone, about starting the next chapter of their lives together. The elevator doors opened to a hallway with signs directing guests to the Hayes Law Group opening reception, and Michael followed the signs to a set of double doors that were propped open, revealing a large office suite that had been transformed into a party space. The first thing he noticed was how many people were there, the space packed with well-dressed individuals, holding wine glasses and talking in small groups, the buzz of conversation and laughter filling the air. The second thing he noticed was how expensive everything looked, from the modern furniture visible in the offices to the elaborate catering setup to the open bar to the professionally designed signage and branding materials scattered throughout the space. Michael had invested a lot of money in this venture, but seeing it all in person made him realize it was even more than he had calculated, and a small voice in his head wondered about costs and budgets, but he pushed it aside because tonight was about celebration, not accounting. He walked into the reception area looking for Victoria, wanting to find his wife and congratulate her, and that's when he heard it, a voice from somewhere in the crowd that cut through the other noise like a knife, loud enough to be heard, deliberate in its volume and its cruelty. A voice that said the words that would change everything. "Oh, my God, the test-run husband is here. I can't believe she actually invited him. This is going to be hilarious." Michael stopped walking, the words hitting him like a physical blow, confusion and shock, and a dawning horror spreading through his chest. Test-run husband, what did that even mean? Surely he had misheard, surely it was about someone else. But then he saw people turning to look at him, saw smiles that were wrong, smiles that held mockery, and amusement and pity, saw people whispering to each other, and pointing in his direction, and the horrible reality began to sink in that they were talking about him, that he was the test-run husband, that somehow his wife's colleagues and friends knew something he didn't, something that turned his marriage into a joke they were all in on. He stood frozen in the doorway, feeling exposed and humiliated, feeling every eye in the room on him, hearing laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and his mind raced trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to find an explanation that didn't shatter everything he believed about his life and his marriage. Then the crowd parted, and he saw Victoria, his wife, standing near the center of the room, looking stunning in a red dress that probably cost thousands of dollars, and she was looking directly at him with an expression that was cold, so cold, nothing like the woman he had kissed goodbye that morning, nothing like the woman he had married, everything about her face and posture communicating distance and disdain, and Michael's blood turned to ice because he suddenly understood that something very bad was about to happen, something he hadn't seen coming, something Victoria had planned. Victoria walked toward him with the crowd watching, silence spreading through the room. As people sensed drama unfolding, and she stopped a few feet away from Michael, close enough to speak to him but far enough to maintain separation, far enough to make it clear they weren't together, weren't united, weren't anything he thought they were. She held an envelope in her hand, expensive paper that matched the invitation, and she extended it toward him with a smile that was all edges and no warmth, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice clear and strong and completely devoid of emotion, said words that would replay in Michael's mind for years afterward, words that would haunt his dreams and poison his memories. "Michael, thank you for coming. I'm glad you could make it to witness the opening of my firm. The first official act of Hayes Law Group, the first client we're serving, is handling my divorce from you. These are the papers, sign them and leave. Your job here is done." The room erupted in gasps and whispers, and a few people actually laughed at his humiliation, laughed at his shock, laughed at his pain, and Michael stood there holding the envelope that contained divorce papers, holding the physical evidence that his marriage was over, that his wife had been planning this, had set him up for public humiliation, had invited him to her law firm opening specifically so she could destroy him in front of an audience. Michael's hands shook as he processed what was happening, his mind struggling to catch up, struggling to understand how he had gotten here, how he had missed this, how the woman he loved and trusted had turned into this stranger with cruel eyes who was divorcing him at her own party. Questions flooded his mind, questions he wanted to shout but couldn't seem to form into words, questions about why and how long she had been planning this, and what he had done to deserve this, and whether anything about their relationship had been real. But he didn't shout, didn't demand answers, didn't make a scene. Because even in his shock and pain and humiliation, Michael's mind was working, was calculating, was understanding that Victoria wanted him to break down, wanted him to beg or cry or make himself look even more pathetic in front of all these people, wanted to cement her narrative. That he was weak, was nothing, was just a test-run husband who had served his purpose and could now be discarded. And Michael decided in that moment that he wouldn't give her the satisfaction, wouldn't play the role she had scripted for him, would walk out with whatever dignity he could, salvage, and then he would respond in ways she hadn't anticipated, in ways that would show her that he was not weak, was not nothing, was someone she would deeply regret underestimating. Chapter 6. Michael looked at Victoria for a long moment, looked at this woman he had loved and supported and believed in, this woman who had just publicly destroyed their marriage, and he felt something shift inside him, felt the hurt begin to crystallize into something harder and colder and more useful. He took the envelope from her hand without opening it, without looking at the papers inside, and he spoke for the first and only time since entering the room, his voice quiet but steady, the voice of someone who was done, who was finished, who was already moving on in his mind. Consider it done. Then he turned and walked toward the elevator, walked through a crowd that parted for him with whispers following in his wake, walked with his head up and his shoulders back, refusing to show the devastation he felt inside, refusing to give them the broken man they expected to see. The elevator ride down felt endless, those few seconds stretching into eternity, and only when the doors closed and he was alone did Michael's careful composure crack, did he lean against the wall and close his eyes and take deep breaths, trying to hold himself together, trying not to fall apart in a building elevator where security cameras would capture his breakdown. He made it to his car, sat in the driver's seat with the divorce envelope beside him, and he let himself feel it then. Let the wave of emotions crash over him, grief and rage and betrayal and humiliation all mixing together into something that hurt so badly he thought he might physically come apart. But Michael didn't fall apart, didn't sit in that parking lot crying until security asked him to leave, because he had learned long ago that emotions were temporary but actions were permanent, that feelings needed to be felt, but then they needed to be channeled into something productive, something useful, something that would change his situation rather than just expressing his pain. He pulled out his phone with hands that still shook slightly, and he started making calls, started setting in motion a plan that was forming in his mind, a plan that would show Victoria exactly what she had done, exactly what she had thrown away, exactly how badly she had miscalculated in thinking he would just sign papers and disappear quietly. First call was to his lawyer, a man named Richard who had handled his business contracts and property purchases for years, waking him on a Saturday evening and apologizing for the intrusion, but saying it was an emergency, explaining the situation quickly, and asking Richard what he needed to do immediately to protect himself, to stop the bleeding, to prepare for what was coming. Richard was shocked, having met Victoria multiple times and considered her a friend, but he switched quickly into professional mode. Told Michael not to sign anything without him reviewing it, told him to document everything, told him to start gathering financial records and evidence of what he had contributed to the marriage, told him to cut off access to any joint accounts or credit cards immediately, and told him to be very careful about what he said or did, because anything could be used against him in divorce proceedings. Second call was to his accountant, a woman named Sarah, who managed his business finances and his personal finances, and knew every dollar he had and where it was, explaining the situation and asking her to prepare a complete accounting of everything he had contributed to Victoria's law firm, every payment and transfer and investment, every dollar he had given her for her business, asking Sarah to have it ready by Monday morning because he was going to need it. Sarah was sympathetic but efficient, told him she would pull all the records, would create a detailed report, would document the full extent of his financial contributions, and she also suggested he freeze any credit cards Victoria had access to and transfer money out of joint accounts into personal accounts before Victoria could drain them, because in divorce situations it was common for spouses to try to grab whatever assets they could as quickly as possible. Third call was to his bank, speaking to the after-hours service and requesting immediate holds on joint accounts and credit cards, requesting transfers of funds from joint accounts into his personal accounts, protecting his money from being taken, protecting assets he had earned and saved and built over years of work. The customer service representative was understanding, said she had seen this situation before, processed the requests quickly, and within 20 minutes Michael's joint financial accounts were locked and the money that was legally his was secured where Victoria couldn't touch it. But Michael didn't stop there, because protecting himself wasn't enough. Because he understood that Victoria had declared war, and in war, you didn't just defend, you attacked, you hit back in ways that hurt. In ways that showed your opponent they had made a terrible mistake. He pulled up the contract Victoria had signed when he invested in her law firm, the legal document that outlined his $20 million investment and the terms of that investment, and he reviewed it carefully, looking for clauses and conditions and ways out, and he found what he needed, a clause that stated he could withdraw his investment at any time within the first 6 months of operation if business conditions changed significantly, or if the business relationship was compromised. The firm had officially opened tonight, which meant they were definitely within the first 6 months. And the business relationship was certainly compromised given that Victoria had just served him divorce papers at the opening party, which meant he had legal grounds to pull his money, to withdraw his $20 million investment, to remove the foundation she had built her firm on. Michael called Richard back, asked him to review the contract, asked if he was reading it correctly, and Richard confirmed that yes, Michael absolutely could withdraw his investment under these circumstances, that the contract Victoria had signed gave him that right, and Richard also noted with a hint of satisfaction in his voice that without that $20 million the firm would almost certainly collapse immediately, that Victoria had spent most of it already on office space and hiring and equipment and startup costs, that she would be left with a firm she couldn't afford to operate, and debts she couldn't afford to pay. Michael felt a grim satisfaction settle over him, the first positive emotion he had felt since walking into that party, because he realized he held more power than Victoria had calculated, held the ability to destroy what she had built just as thoroughly as she had tried to destroy him. He composed an email to Victoria and to the law firm she had supposedly started, an email that was professionally worded and legally sound, citing the contract clause and the compromised business relationship, and officially notifying her that he was withdrawing his $20 million investment effective immediately, that any funds remaining from his investment should be returned within 30 days as the contract specified, and that he expected full accounting of how his money had been spent. He copied Richard on the email and Sarah on the email, making sure there were witnesses to his notification, making sure the documentation was solid, and then he hit send and watched the email disappear into the void, knowing it would land like a bomb, knowing it would destroy everything Victoria thought she had accomplished. Then Michael made more calls to the party planner he knew Victoria had hired because he had seen the invoice, calls to the catering company, calls to the office furniture supplier, calls to every vendor he could identify that Victoria had contracted with for the firm, and he canceled every payment he had authorized, stopped every check that hadn't cleared, invoked clauses in contracts that allowed him to withdraw as the financial guarantor, systematically dismantling the financial foundation of Hayes Law Group with the same methodical precision he had used to build his own businesses. With each call, with each cancellation, with each withdrawal, Michael felt lighter, felt the humiliation and hurt transforming into something else, something like justice, something like revenge. And he understood that this was his response to being called a test-run husband. This was his response to being publicly humiliated. This was his response to having his love and trust and support thrown back in his face like trash. He spent 3 hours in his car in that parking lot making calls and sending emails and canceling contracts, 3 hours systematically destroying what Victoria had built on his money, and when he was finally done, when every payment was stopped, and every contract was canceled, and every dollar was secured or withdrawn, Michael started his car and drove home through dark streets, feeling exhausted but also feeling satisfied, feeling like he had fought back, like he had shown Victoria that he wasn't weak, wasn't someone who could be discarded without consequences. He went home to the house they had bought together, the house that was in both their names, but that he had paid for entirely, and he poured himself a drink and sat in the dark living room waiting, knowing that soon his phone would start ringing, knowing that Victoria would realize what he had done, knowing that she was about to understand exactly what she had lost. Chapter 7. Michael sat in the dark living room for approximately 23 minutes before his phone started buzzing, vibrating on the coffee table, with increasing urgency, the screen lighting up with incoming calls and texts that started as a trickle and quickly became a flood. He picked up the phone and watched notifications pile up, call after call from Victoria, from numbers he didn't recognize that were probably people at the party, from Richard his lawyer, from Sarah his accountant, from vendors and companies and individuals who were all suddenly realizing that the money they expected was gone, that the checks they counted on were canceled, that the foundation of Hayes Law Group had just evaporated. Michael didn't answer any of the calls, just watched them accumulate, watched the missed call counter climb, watched Victoria's name appear over and over and over again, with a persistence that would have been flattering if the circumstances were different, if she was calling because she loved him instead of because she needed him, if she was reaching out as a wife instead of as someone panicking about money. The texts that came through were increasingly desperate, starting with confusion, asking what was happening with the payments and the investments, progressing to anger, demanding he fix whatever mistake had been made, and eventually deteriorating into panic, begging him to call back, saying they needed to talk, saying there had been a misunderstanding, saying things that made it clear Victoria had realized the magnitude of what he had done. The calls continued for hours, the number climbing higher and higher, and Michael left his phone on the table and went upstairs to pack Victoria's things, methodically going through closets and drawers and pulling out everything that belonged to her, folding clothes and boxing shoes and gathering jewelry and cosmetics and all the possessions she had accumulated during their marriage. He worked steadily and without emotion, treating it like any other task that needed completing, and by 3 a.m, he had packed 27 boxes and 6 suitcases with Victoria's belongings, had stacked them neatly in the garage, had removed every trace of her from their bedroom and bathroom and closet, had erased her presence from his space. Then he changed the locks on all the doors, a simple task that took 20 minutes with a screwdriver, and lock sets he had on hand because he owned rental properties and changed locks regularly, and when he was done, Victoria would not be able to walk into this house without his permission, would not have access to what was his, would learn that her actions had consequences that extended beyond money. Michael went back to his phone and saw the missed call counter had climbed to 456 calls, an absurd number. That represented roughly 1 call every few minutes for the past 6 hours, representing desperation beyond anything he had ever witnessed, and still he didn't answer, didn't respond. Let the calls and texts pile up like evidence of exactly how badly Victoria needed what he had provided, exactly how much power he had held all along without realizing it. At 4:30 in the morning, just as dawn was beginning to hint at its arrival, Michael heard a car pull into his driveway with speed that suggested urgency, heard a car door slam and footsteps running to the front door, and then pounding on that door, fists hitting wood with force that made the door shudder, and he knew without looking that Victoria had come, that she had finally left her law firm opening party, or wherever she had been, and had come here to confront him, to demand answers, to try to fix what he had broken. He walked to the door slowly, not hurrying, making her wait, making her understand that he controlled this interaction. Now, and when he finally opened the door, he found Victoria standing on his porch, looking nothing like the composed, cruel woman who had handed him divorce papers, looking instead like someone who had spent the night crying and panicking, her makeup smeared and her expensive dress wrinkled and her hair disheveled. And when she saw him, she started talking immediately, words tumbling out in a rush, saying there had been a terrible misunderstanding, saying she hadn't meant what happened at the party, saying it was all a joke that went too far, saying they could work this out, saying she loved him, saying every word he had wanted to hear for years, but none of them landing because they were too late, were coming from the wrong motivation, were transparently about money instead of love. Michael let her talk until she ran out of words, let her exhaust herself with explanations and justifications, and pleas. And then he responded with a calmness that was more devastating than anger would have been, told her that he had received her divorce papers, and would be happy to sign them, that he had withdrawn his investment from her law firm, as was his legal right under the contract she had signed, that he had cancelled all payments and contracts for which he was financially responsible, because he was no longer willing to fund her business, that he had packed her belongings and they were in the garage, and she was welcome to take them, and that she was no longer welcome in his house, as he had changed the locks, and she should make arrangements to stay elsewhere going forward. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions as he spoke, shock and disbelief and anger and desperation, and she tried to push past him into the house, but he blocked her, held firm, told her this was no longer her home, told her she had made her choice when she handed him divorce papers in front of a room full of people, told her she couldn't unmake that choice just because the consequences were worse than she expected. She started crying then, real tears streaming down her face, and she tried a different approach, tried to touch him, tried to appeal to their history, said she had made a mistake, said she was under a lot of stress, said her colleagues had pressured her into making a dramatic statement to establish her independence, said she hadn't thought it through, said she would do anything to fix this. Michael felt nothing watching her cry, felt no sympathy or softness or temptation to forgive, because he understood that these were the tears of someone who had lost access to his money, not of someone who had lost him. These were the tears of someone facing consequences, not of someone facing genuine remorse. He told Victoria that if she wanted to discuss the divorce, she could contact him through Richard, his lawyer, that he would not be communicating with her directly, that whatever they needed to resolve would be resolved through legal channels, and he suggested she hire a lawyer to represent her interests because Hayes Law Group clearly couldn't do it, given that the firm no longer had funding and would probably be dissolved within days. Victoria's tears stopped abruptly at that, replaced by anger, her face transforming into something ugly, and she started yelling at him, called him petty and vindictive and cruel, said he was destroying her career out of spite, said he was proving he never really loved her, said real men didn't abandon their wives just because of a mistake, said he was nothing without her anyway, just a kid from Millbrook who got lucky with some real estate deals, and she had been doing him a favor by staying with him as long as she had, giving him legitimacy and class and access to a world he would never have reached without her. The words were meant to hurt, were meant to make him doubt himself, were the last weapons she had left, but they bounced off Michael harmlessly because he knew they weren't true, knew his success had nothing to do with her, knew he had built everything himself, and her attempt to claim credit for his achievements just confirmed what he was already learning, that he had never really known Victoria at all, had been in love with a performance rather than a person. Michael told Victoria calmly that she needed to leave, that her things were packed and in the garage, and she should collect them and go, and when she refused, when she planted herself on his porch and said she wasn't leaving until he fixed this, he pulled out his phone and started dialing the police, explaining that he would report trespassing if she didn't leave voluntarily. Victoria looked shocked that he would actually call the police on her, looked like she couldn't believe he was serious. But when the dispatcher answered and Michael started providing his address, Victoria finally moved, finally walked to the garage and started loading boxes and suitcases into her car, making multiple trips and shooting him furious looks each time, and Michael watched impassively, helping with nothing, saying nothing, just waiting for her to finish and leave. On her final trip she stopped in front of him and tried one more time, her voice desperate and raw, asked him how he could do this to her, how he could destroy everything she had worked for. Didn't he understand she had nothing without the firm, nowhere to go, no way to pay for the office space, or the employees, or any of it? Didn't he care what happened to her at all? Michael looked at his wife, this woman who had called him a test-run husband, this woman who had planned his humiliation as entertainment for her colleagues, this woman who had turned their marriage into a transaction she was now canceling. And he told her the truth, told her that she should have thought about consequences before handing him divorce papers at her law firm opening, should have considered what she was throwing away before she threw it, should have remembered that the money she spent so freely came from somewhere, came from someone, came from him, and now she would learn what life was like without it. Chapter 8. Victoria left as the sun was rising, her car packed with boxes and her face streaked with mascara, and Michael closed his door and locked it and went upstairs to his bedroom. That no longer held any trace of her, and he lay down on his bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling trying to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. He had gone to a party expecting to celebrate his wife's success and had returned home having destroyed that success, had gone from happily married to separated and heading for divorce, had gone from trusting and supportive husband to betrayed and vengeful ex, and the speed of the transformation left him feeling disoriented, like he had fallen through a trapdoor into a different life. His phone continued buzzing with calls and messages, but he ignored it, needed silence, needed time to think, needed to figure out what came next, because while he had responded decisively in the moment, he hadn't really planned beyond that, hadn't thought about what his life would look like going forward, hadn't imagined a future. That didn't include Victoria, because even in his worst moments he had believed they would work through anything. Sleep wouldn't come despite his exhaustion, his mind too active and too loud, replaying the scene at the law firm, opening over and over, analyzing every detail, trying to understand how he had missed the signs, how he had been so blind to what Victoria was planning, how she had managed to make him believe everything was fine when she was actually preparing to publicly humiliate and divorce him. By Monday morning, Michael was exhausted but focused, having spent the weekend piecing together information, making more calls, meeting with Richard, his lawyer, to go over the divorce papers and his rights and his strategy, meeting with Sarah, his accountant, to review the accounting of money he had given Victoria and how much could potentially be recovered, and beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. Victoria's divorce papers were aggressive, asking for half of everything Michael owned, including his real estate portfolio and his businesses, claiming that she had supported his career and deserved to share in his success, claiming that they had been partners in every sense and she had contributed equally, even if not financially. And Richard said this was going to be a fight, was going to be expensive and time-consuming and ugly, but he also said Michael had strong positions, had proof of what he had built before the marriage, and what he had built during the marriage with his own money and effort, had documentation that Victoria's career and firm were funded entirely by him, and had the trump card of having withdrawn his investment, which meant Victoria couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle, even if she wanted one. Sarah's accounting was revealing and disturbing, showing that Michael had given Victoria $20 million for her law firm over the course of a year, money transferred in chunks as she claimed to need it for various expenses. But Sarah had done some investigating and had discovered that Hayes Law Group's actual expenses were maybe $12 million, which meant $8 million was unaccounted for, had gone somewhere other than the business, and Sarah suggested Michael demand a full accounting and consider whether Victoria had committed fraud or embezzlement. But more disturbing than missing money was information that started coming to Michael from unexpected sources, former colleagues and friends who had apparently been at the law firm opening party and had witnessed his humiliation, and who now felt guilty enough to reach out, to tell him things they thought he should know, to share truths that Victoria had kept hidden. The first call came from a woman named Jennifer who worked at the same law firm Victoria had worked at before starting her own practice, and Jennifer was crying as she explained that she had never liked what Victoria was doing but hadn't felt like it was her place to interfere, hadn't wanted to get involved in someone else's marriage, but after seeing what happened Saturday night, she couldn't stay silent anymore. Jennifer told Michael that Victoria had been having an affair for at least 6 months, maybe longer, with another lawyer named Harrison Prescott, who was a partner at a competing firm, and that everyone at Victoria's old firm knew about it, had seen them together at legal conferences and bar association events, had heard Victoria talking about Harrison like he was her real partner while Michael was just the money guy, just the bank that funded her life, just the test-run husband she was using until she could afford to upgrade. Jennifer said Victoria and Harrison had apparently planned to merge their practices once Victoria's firm was established, had planned to become a power couple in the legal world, and Harrison came from old money and connections and was exactly the kind of man Victoria had always wanted, someone who could give her the social status and professional legitimacy she craved, and Michael had apparently been a stepping stone, someone useful until someone better came along. Michael listened to Jennifer with a coldness spreading through his chest, a numbness that was probably his mind's way of protecting him from the full impact of what he was learning, and he thanked her for telling him and hung up and sat very still trying to absorb this information. Victoria had been cheating on him, had been planning to leave him, had used him for his money and his support while building a life that didn't include him, and the test-run husband comment wasn't just a cruel joke but an actual description of how she saw him, how she had always seen him, as temporary, as practice, as something to use and discard when something better appeared. More calls came throughout the day, more people who had been at the party or who knew Victoria, or who felt compelled to share what they knew, and a picture emerged that was consistent and devastating. Victoria had been telling people for months that she was only staying with Michael until her firm was established, that he was a good provider but not the kind of man she wanted long-term, that he was too blue-collar and too focused on money, and not sophisticated enough for the world she was entering. And she had apparently laughed about him with colleagues, had made jokes about his background and his manners and his lack of polish, had presented him as an embarrassment she was stuck with temporarily. Every revelation felt like a knife to Michael's chest, every piece of information confirming that his marriage had been a lie, that the woman he loved had never existed, that he had been played more completely than he could have imagined. Richard called with more information that had legal implications, having done some investigating of his own through connections in the legal community, and what he learned was explosive. Harrison Prescott, Victoria's affair partner, had apparently also invested in Hayes Law Group, had put in $5 million and was planning to merge his practice with Victoria's once her firm was established, and Harrison's money explained some of the discrepancy in Victoria's expenses, explained where some of Michael's investment had actually gone. Victoria had been using Michael's money to pay for office space and staff while using Harrison's money and possibly Michael's money for personal expenses, for the lifestyle she wanted to project, for the apartment she had apparently rented where she and Harrison spent time together. Richard explained that this information was useful for the divorce, showed that Victoria had been fraudulent and unfaithful and was not entitled to the spousal support she was demanding. But Richard also warned that Harrison Prescott came from a powerful family with connections throughout the legal system, that fighting them would be difficult, that Victoria now had access to resources Michael couldn't match in terms of legal influence and social pressure. Michael listened to this warning and felt anger replace the numbness, felt his determination harden into something unbreakable because he understood that Victoria and Harrison thought they could destroy him, thought his blue-collar background meant he would be easy to beat, thought his lack of connections and pedigree meant he was vulnerable, and he decided right then that he would prove them wrong, would show them that money and determination could beat connections and privilege, would make them regret underestimating the kid from Millbrook, who had built an empire from nothing. The week following the law firm opening was chaotic in ways Michael hadn't anticipated, with consequences rippling out from his decisions in patterns he couldn't have predicted. Hayes Law Group collapsed within 72 hours of his investment withdrawal. Unable to pay rent or staff or vendors, with employees quitting and creditors calling and the office space being reclaimed by the landlord, and Victoria's dream firm existed for exactly one weekend before imploding spectacularly. The legal community was apparently talking about nothing else. The story of the law firm opening, and the divorce papers and the investment withdrawal spreading like wildfire, and opinions were divided. Some people thought Michael was vindictive and cruel for destroying Victoria's career, while others thought Victoria got exactly what she deserved for humiliating her husband publicly. Michael didn't care what people thought, wasn't interested in public opinion or reputation management, was focused entirely on protecting himself and his assets and moving forward with his life. Victoria tried repeatedly to contact him, leaving hundreds of voicemails. That progressed from angry to pleading to threatening. But Michael never responded, communicated only through Richard, let his lawyer handle every interaction, maintained boundaries that Victoria kept trying to cross. She hired a lawyer eventually, presumably funded by Harrison Prescott since she had no money of her own, and the divorce proceedings began in earnest, with motions and counter-motions and demands and refusals, with both sides digging in for what was clearly going to be a protracted battle. Chapter 9. 3 weeks after the law firm opening disaster, Sarah the accountant called Michael with urgency in her voice, told him she had found something important, something that changed everything, and she needed to meet with him and Richard immediately. They convened at Richard's office that afternoon, and Sarah laid out documents and spreadsheets and bank statements that she had obtained through legal channels and through her own investigative work, and what she had discovered was worse than Michael had imagined, and also better for his legal position. Sarah had traced Michael's $20 million investment through Victoria's accounts, and had discovered that, of that $20 million, only $9 million had actually gone to legitimate business expenses for Hayes Law Group, while $11 million had been diverted to other accounts, to personal spending, to investments in properties that were titled only in Victoria's name, to transfers that supported Harrison Prescott's business ventures, to a lifestyle that was far more expensive than Michael had realized. Victoria had apparently been living a completely separate life funded by Michael's money, had been buying designer clothes and expensive jewelry, and had purchased a luxury condo downtown that Michael knew nothing about, had been taking trips with Harrison that she claimed were for legal conferences, but were actually vacations, had been spending Michael's money to build a life with another man while pretending everything was fine at home. Sarah explained that this level of deception and financial fraud gave Michael significant leverage in the divorce, that Victoria had essentially stolen from him, had misappropriated funds that were supposed to be business investments for personal use, and that Michael could potentially file criminal charges in addition to civil claims, could have Victoria prosecuted for fraud and embezzlement if he chose to pursue that route. Richard agreed, said this discovery changed their entire strategy, said they could now go on offense, instead of just defense, could demand full restitution plus damages plus legal fees, could make Victoria's life extremely difficult unless she agreed to a settlement that was favorable to Michael. Accepting minimal spousal support or property division, essentially walking away with nothing. Michael listened to all of this with a satisfaction that was cold and calculated. Understanding that he now held all the cards, that Victoria had overplayed her hand and had been sloppy in her deception, and her sloppiness had given him the weapon he needed to end this on his terms. But Michael also felt something like sadness beneath the satisfaction, sadness that his marriage had come to this, that the woman he loved had turned out to be a fraud, that years of his life had been built on lies. And he found himself grieving not for Victoria as she actually was, but for Victoria as he had believed her to be, for the partnership he thought they had, for the future he had imagined that would never exist. Richard reached out to Victoria's lawyer with their findings, laying out the evidence of financial fraud and the potential criminal charges, making it clear that Michael was prepared to pursue every legal avenue available, unless Victoria agreed to dissolve the marriage quickly and quietly, keeping nothing except what she had brought into the marriage, which was essentially nothing. Victoria's lawyer tried to bluff initially, claimed the evidence was circumstantial and wouldn't hold up in court. Claimed Victoria had every right to spend marital funds however she chose, but Richard called the bluff, filed preliminary motions with the court including the detailed accounting and bank records, and within 48 hours Victoria's lawyer was calling to negotiate, suddenly much more reasonable, suddenly willing to discuss settlement terms. The negotiations were brutal and one-sided, with Michael holding all the leverage, and using it ruthlessly, and within 2 weeks they had reached an agreement. Victoria would waive all claims to Michael's properties and businesses, and investments, would accept zero spousal support, would return what remained of the diverted $11 million, which was approximately $7 million after her spending spree, would sign a non-disclosure agreement, preventing her from discussing their marriage or the divorce publicly, and would admit no wrongdoing while receiving no criminal charges. It was an unconditional surrender dressed up as a settlement, and Victoria had no choice but to accept, because the alternative was criminal prosecution and public exposure of everything she had done, professional disgrace that would prevent her from practicing law, and social destruction that would cost her the life she had been trying to build. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in a courthouse conference room, both parties present with their lawyers but not speaking to each other, not making eye contact, treating it like a business transaction rather than the end of a marriage, which was fitting, given that the marriage had apparently been a business transaction for Victoria all along. Michael signed the papers without emotion, watched Victoria sign with shaking hands, and tears streaming down her face, and felt nothing except relief that it was over, that he could finally close this chapter and move forward, that he was free of someone who had never valued him as anything more than a resource to exploit. When they left the courthouse, Victoria tried one last time to approach him, tried to say something that might have been an apology or an explanation or a final manipulation, but Michael walked past her. Without slowing, got in his car, and drove away without looking back. And that was the last time he saw Victoria Hayes in person, the last time he had to face the woman who had betrayed him so thoroughly. Richard called later to confirm that the settlement was recorded and official, that Victoria had 45 days to return the $7 million she owed, that the non-disclosure agreement was binding and enforceable, and that Michael was officially divorced, officially single, officially free to move on with his life however he chose. The weeks following the divorce were strange for Michael, feeling simultaneously liberated and lost, free from Victoria's presence but uncertain about what came next, successful in his revenge but not particularly satisfied by it, vindicated legally but emotionally hollow. He threw himself into work with even more intensity than usual, buying 3 more properties in rapid succession, expanding his construction company into commercial projects, launching a new property management software company that he had been planning for months, filling every hour with productivity and progress and achievement because empty hours led to thinking, and thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to pain he preferred to avoid. His friends and family were supportive but didn't quite know what to say, couldn't understand what he had been through because most of them had never experienced betrayal at that level, had never had someone they loved completely turn out to be a lie, and Michael found himself isolating, declining invitations, spending evenings alone in his house that felt too big and too quiet now that he was the only one in it. He went to therapy, recognizing that he needed help processing everything, needed someone objective to help him sort through the emotions and the trauma and the questions about what he had missed and how he could trust anyone again, and his therapist was helpful in providing coping strategies and perspective. But ultimately Michael knew that healing would take time, would require patience with himself, would mean accepting that some scars were permanent even if they eventually stopped hurting. 6 months after the divorce, Michael received a check from Victoria's lawyer for $7 million. The full amount she owed for the diverted funds, and attached to the check was a note in Victoria's handwriting, the first direct communication they had had since the courthouse, and the note said simply, "You were right to walk away. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you find someone who deserves you." Michael read the note 3 times trying to decode its meaning, trying to determine if it was genuine remorse or another manipulation, trying to decide if Victoria had actually learned something or was just sorry she got caught, and ultimately he decided it didn't matter, that whatever Victoria felt or didn't feel was her problem, not his, that her apology didn't change what had happened and didn't heal what she had broken, and he put the check in the bank and threw the note away and decided that was the end, that he wouldn't think about Victoria Hayes anymore, wouldn't give her any more space in his mind or his life, would treat her as a closed chapter, a painful lesson, a cautionary tale about trust and love and the danger of seeing what you want to see instead of what's actually there. He was 30 years old, successful beyond his wildest childhood dreams, financially secure for life if he never worked another day, but he was also divorced and betrayed, and carrying wounds that he suspected would never fully heal. And he had to figure out how to move forward from here, how to build a life that felt meaningful when the future he had planned was no longer possible, how to trust anyone again when trust had been so thoroughly weaponized against him. Chapter 10. It was a Saturday morning in early spring, 8 months after the divorce was finalized, when Michael's doorbell rang at 7:30, early enough that he was still in workout clothes, having just finished a run, and he wasn't expecting anyone, didn't have appointments or deliveries scheduled, so the bell ringing was puzzling and slightly annoying. He walked to the door debating whether to answer, not in the mood for solicitors or lost neighbors. But something made him look through the peephole, and what he saw made his breath catch. Standing on his porch was a woman he had never seen before, probably in her early 60s, well-dressed in a way that suggested money and class, holding a folder and looking nervous but determined, and there was something about her that seemed important, seemed like this wasn't a random visit but something he needed to pay attention to. Michael opened the door and the woman's face flooded with relief, like she had been afraid he wouldn't answer, and she introduced herself as Margaret Caldwell, said she was sorry to show up unannounced, but she had something important to tell him. Something she had been debating for months whether to share. And she had finally decided he deserved to know the truth. Deserved to understand what had really happened with Victoria. Deserved information that would change how he saw everything. Michael invited Margaret inside, curiosity overriding caution, and he made coffee while she settled in his living room. And then he sat down and asked her to explain who she was and why she was here and what truth she was talking about. Margaret took a deep breath and began a story that Michael hadn't seen coming, a story that added new dimensions to everything he thought he understood, and he listened with growing astonishment as she explained that she was Harrison, Prescott's mother, that Harrison was her only child, and she loved him, but that didn't mean she approved of everything he did, and what he had done to Michael was wrong, was manipulative and cruel, and she couldn't stay silent anymore. Margaret explained that Harrison had targeted Victoria deliberately, had researched successful young lawyers and had identified Victoria as someone ambitious and vulnerable to his particular kind of manipulation, someone who wanted status and access to the world Harrison represented. Someone who could be convinced to betray her husband if the right incentives were offered. Harrison had apparently made Victoria a project, had seduced her over months, had filled her head with ideas about what her life could be if she was with someone from his world instead of someone from Michael's world, had convinced her that Michael was holding her back, was beneath her, was something to be embarrassed about rather than proud of, and Harrison had specifically suggested the law firm opening humiliation as a way to assert her independence and make a clean break. Michael felt rage building as Margaret talked, rage at Harrison for orchestrating this, at Victoria for going along with it, at himself for being blind to all of it, but Margaret wasn't finished, had more to tell him, and what came next was even worse. Margaret explained that Harrison was a con artist, had been running similar schemes for years, targeting women who had access to money or were about to have access to money, seducing them and manipulating them and convincing them to invest in his ventures or give him control of their assets, and then disappearing once the money was gone, leaving them financially and emotionally destroyed. Harrison had apparently done this to at least 4 women that Margaret knew of, possibly more. And she had tried to stop him, had tried to get him help, had threatened to cut off his trust fund, but Harrison was a sociopath or something close to it, charming and convincing and completely without conscience, and he always managed to talk his way out of consequences. Margaret said that Harrison had targeted Victoria specifically because she had access to Michael's money, had researched Michael and known he was a successful investor with significant resources, and the plan had been for Victoria to take half of Michael's assets in the divorce, merge her law firm with Harrison's practice, and essentially transfer Michael's wealth to them, and then Harrison would have eventually drained that wealth and moved on to his next target, leaving Victoria with nothing, just like he left all the others with nothing. Margaret's voice shook as she explained why she was telling Michael this, said that she had watched Harrison destroy Victoria over the past months, had watched Victoria realize she had been manipulated and used, had watched her lose everything, including her career and her reputation and the settlement money that Harrison had convinced her to invest in ventures that promptly failed or never existed at all. And Victoria was now essentially homeless, living with her mother, unable to find work in the legal field because word had spread about the fraud and the scandal, broken in ways Margaret wasn't sure she could recover from. Margaret said she wasn't excusing what Victoria had done, wasn't suggesting Michael should forgive her or help her, but she wanted Michael to understand that Victoria had been a victim too, had been targeted by someone expert at manipulation, had been fed a fantasy that seemed real until it was too late. And the person ultimately responsible was Harrison, was Margaret's own son, and she was ashamed of what he had done and wanted to make sure Michael knew the full story, knew that he hadn't missed obvious signs because there weren't obvious signs, that he had been dealing with a professional con artist operating through Victoria as a proxy. Margaret opened the folder she had brought and pulled out documents, bank records and emails and text messages between Harrison and Victoria that she had obtained through methods she didn't explain, evidence that supported everything she was saying, evidence that showed Harrison calculating every move and Victoria gradually falling under his influence and Michael being discussed as a resource to exploit rather than a person with feelings. Michael read through the documents feeling like he was seeing his marriage from a completely different angle, understanding now that he hadn't just married the wrong person but had been targeted, had been selected as a mark, had been the victim of a long-term con that he never suspected was happening. Part of him wanted to rage at Margaret, wanted to blame her for raising a monster, wanted to say that this information changed nothing, because Victoria had still made choices, had still humiliated him, had still stolen from him, but another part of him felt something like closure, understanding finally why it had happened, why Victoria had changed or had revealed who she really was, why nothing he did or said or gave had been enough because he was never the point, was just the means to an end in someone else's scheme. He asked Margaret what she wanted from him, why she had really come, whether this was some attempt to prevent him from pursuing further legal action against Harrison, and Margaret surprised him by saying she wanted nothing, expected nothing, just felt he deserved truth, deserved to know he hadn't failed or missed something or been inadequate, that he had simply been unlucky enough to cross paths with Harrison, who was very good at what he did, and she hoped this information would help Michael move forward, would help him trust again someday, would prevent him from blaming himself for something that wasn't his fault. She stood to leave and Michael walked her to the door, thanked her for coming even though he wasn't sure how he felt about anything she had told him, and Margaret paused at the threshold and said one more thing. Victoria had asked her to tell Michael something if she ever got the chance, asked her to tell him that loving him had been the only real thing in their marriage, that everything else had been Harrison's poison, but her feelings for Michael had been genuine, and she was sorry, was so sorry for not being strong enough to resist the manipulation, for believing Harrison's lies, for destroying the one good thing in her life, and she understood if Michael hated her and she didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted him to know that he had been loved, even if poorly, even if not enough, even if ultimately betrayed. Margaret left, and Michael closed the door and stood in his entryway, trying to process this new information, trying to integrate it with everything he thought he knew, trying to decide if it changed anything fundamental or just added context to the same painful story. He spent the day reviewing the documents Margaret had left, seeing his marriage laid out in emails and texts and bank transfers, seeing Harrison's manipulation and Victoria's gradual corruption and his own presence as a background figure, someone discussed but not really considered, someone's husband but not really someone's partner, and the evidence supported Margaret's story completely, showed that Victoria had been targeted and manipulated and eventually destroyed by someone who did this professionally, who had practice and skill and no conscience. Michael didn't know what to do with this information, didn't know if it made things better or worse, didn't know if Victoria, deserving some sympathy, changed how he felt about what had happened to him, and he realized that healing wasn't linear, wasn't something you achieved and then you were done, but was something you worked at constantly, adjusting and readjusting your understanding, accepting new information and integrating it without letting it destroy the progress you had made. He decided finally that Margaret's revelation didn't change his decisions and didn't make him regret his actions, because Victoria had still made choices regardless of Harrison's influence, had still participated in the humiliation and the fraud and the betrayal, but it did help him understand that the situation had been more complex than he realized, that Victoria wasn't simply evil or heartless, but was herself a victim of someone worse, and that understanding allowed him to release some of the anger he had been carrying, to forgive not what she did but the person she was, to accept that people were complicated and situations were messy, and sometimes there were no clear villains and heroes, just people making choices and dealing with consequences. Chapter 11. Life continued for Michael with the strange quality of moving forward while feeling stuck, of achieving success after success in business while feeling empty in the places that mattered, of being surrounded by people but feeling fundamentally alone, and he existed in this state for more than a year after Margaret's visit, functional but not fully alive, successful but not satisfied, healing but not healed. His businesses thrived, his real estate portfolio expanded to 37 properties, his construction company landed major commercial projects, his property management software company was acquired by a larger tech firm for a sum that added another $8 million to his net worth, and by the time he was 32 years old, Michael's net worth exceeded $40 million, putting him firmly in the category of wealthy by anyone's measure, but the wealth felt hollow, felt like numbers on a screen rather than security or freedom, and he found himself thinking, often about his younger self, about the kid collecting cans in Millbrook, who thought money would solve everything, would make him happy, and he wished he could tell that kid that money solved problems but created others, that success didn't equal satisfaction, that the things you thought you wanted weren't always the things you needed. Michael's therapist suggested he try dating again, said he had done the work of processing the trauma and understanding the betrayal, and forgiving himself for missing signs he couldn't have seen, and it was time to take the risk of letting someone in again, time to accept that Victoria's betrayal didn't mean everyone would betray him, that his judgment wasn't fundamentally broken just because one person had fooled him, that he deserved companionship and love and the chance to build something real with someone trustworthy. Michael was resistant initially, felt too raw and too cautious and too aware of how badly things could go, but eventually he agreed to try, started going on dates arranged by friends or through apps, meeting women over coffee or dinner and making awkward conversation and trying to feel something, trying to find a connection, trying to imagine a future with someone new. The dates were universally disappointing, not because the women weren't nice or attractive or interesting, but because Michael found himself comparing everyone to Victoria, or more accurately comparing everyone to his memory of Victoria, before he knew what she really was, and nobody measured up to the fantasy he had believed in, nobody generated the excitement and certainty he had felt with her, and he started to worry that Victoria had broken something in him that couldn't be fixed, that his ability to love and trust was permanently damaged, that he was destined to be alone not by choice but by emotional incapacity. Then Michael met Elena Rodriguez at a real estate investor conference, not looking for romance but for business opportunities, attending a seminar on commercial property development and sitting next to a woman who asked intelligent questions and took detailed notes and clearly knew what she was doing, and when the seminar ended they started talking about the presentation and realized they had similar investment philosophies and complementary skill sets, and they exchanged business cards and agreed to get coffee to discuss potential collaboration. That coffee meeting turned into a 3-hour conversation about real estate and business and life philosophies, and Michael found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in months, found himself interested and engaged, and not thinking about Victoria at all. And when they parted ways he realized he hoped he would see Elena again, hoped that coffee turned into another meeting, hoped that business interest was or could become personal interest. Elena was different from Victoria in fundamental ways, was quiet where Victoria had been loud, was thoughtful where Victoria had been impulsive, was genuine where Victoria had been performative, and she had a calmness and a groundedness that Michael found incredibly appealing, found himself drawn to even though it was nothing like the electric intensity he had felt with Victoria. They met several more times ostensibly to discuss business, and their conversations gradually shifted from entirely professional to more personal, sharing their histories and their goals and their fears, and Michael found himself telling Elena about Victoria and the betrayal and the divorce, something he hadn't planned to share but felt safe sharing with her, and Elena listened without judgment, and without pity, told him her own story of a failed engagement to someone who had wanted her money and not her, and they recognized in each other the specific kind of wounded that comes from being valued for the wrong reasons. The relationship developed slowly, both of them cautious and careful, both carrying scars that made them wary of rushing or assuming or believing too easily, but the slowness felt right, felt healthy, felt like building something on a foundation that could actually support weight. Elena insisted on paying for herself on dates, insisted on maintaining her own business and her own finances, separate from his, insisted that if they were going to be together it would be as equals not as benefactor and dependent, and Michael appreciated this more than he could express because it meant she wasn't there for his money, wasn't trying to position herself to take from him, was actually interested in him as a person rather than as a resource. They spent months getting to know each other, meeting families and friends, integrating into each other's lives gradually and naturally, and Michael found himself falling in love again but differently, falling in love with someone real instead of someone imagined, falling in love based on understanding and compatibility instead of intensity and fantasy. And it felt more solid, even if less dramatic, felt like something that could last because it was built on truth instead of deception. Elena asked him once if he was over Victoria, if he had fully healed from what happened, and Michael answered honestly that he didn't think you ever fully healed from that kind of betrayal, but you learned to carry the scars without letting them control you. Learned to trust again even while remembering that trust could be broken. Learned to love again even while knowing that love could hurt. And Elena said that was the exact right answer. That anyone who claimed to be completely over trauma was either lying or hadn't actually processed it, and his honesty made her trust him more. After a year of dating, Elena and Michael moved in together, taking the step carefully and with clear communication about expectations and boundaries, and what they both needed to feel safe, and living together revealed new dimensions of their compatibility, showed that they functioned well as a team in daily life, not just in conversation, that they handled conflict constructively, and supported each other's goals genuinely, and made each other better without losing themselves. Michael found himself thinking that this was what partnership was supposed to feel like, what marriage was supposed to be, two people choosing each other every day, not because they needed each other but because they wanted each other, not because of what the other person provided, but because of who the other person was. And he realized that what he had with Victoria had never been this, even in the good times, had always been performance and transaction dressed up as love, while what he had with Elena was simple and real and strong precisely because it was built on nothing but genuine affection and respect. They talked about marriage occasionally, both wanting it eventually but neither feeling rushed, both understanding that the paper didn't make the commitment but could formalize and celebrate it when the time was right. And Michael appreciated that. Elena didn't pressure or hint or manipulate, didn't try to lock him down or secure her position, was simply present and patient, and confident that if they were meant to build forever they would, and if they weren't, then forcing it wouldn't help. 2 years after meeting Elena, Michael proposed during a quiet evening at home. No elaborate setup or public display, just the two of them cooking dinner together, and Michael suddenly feeling overwhelmingly certain that he wanted to spend his life with this woman, wanted to legally bind himself to someone who had proven over and over that she was trustworthy and genuine and perfect for him in all the ways that mattered. He got down on one knee right there in the kitchen with flour on his hands, and Elena laughed with tears in her eyes and said yes before he even finished asking, said she had been ready whenever he was, said she loved him and trusted him and wanted to build everything with him, and the simplicity of that moment was more meaningful to Michael than all the elaborate planning of his first proposal had been, because this time he was proposing to someone he actually knew, someone who had seen him at his worst and his best and chose to stay, someone who loved him for reasons that had nothing to do with what he could provide and everything to do with who he was. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony with just family and close friends, nothing like the elaborate wedding he had had with Victoria, and Michael preferred it this way, preferred intimate and meaningful over impressive and expensive, preferred celebrating with people who genuinely cared over putting on a show for acquaintances and strangers. Standing at the altar watching Elena walk toward him, Michael felt peace, felt certainty, felt like his life had finally aligned into what it was supposed to be, and he silently thanked his younger self for not giving up after Victoria, for being willing to try again, for having enough faith in the future to remain open to love even after love had hurt him so badly. Chapter 12. Michael and Elena had been married for 3 years, years that were happy and stable and everything a marriage should be, when Richard, his lawyer, called with news that he clearly didn't want to deliver. His voice heavy with something that sounded like reluctance, or maybe dread. Richard asked if Michael could come to his office, said it was important but not urgent, said it concerned Victoria and Michael should probably be sitting down when he heard it, and Michael felt his stomach drop because he had moved on, had built a new life, had thought Victoria was firmly in his past, and the idea that she was about to intrude again filled him with frustration and worry. He told Elena where he was going, and she offered to come with him for support, but Michael said this was something he needed to handle alone, needed to face whatever was coming without dragging her into his past, and Elena understood. Kissed him and told him she was there if he needed her, and Michael drove to Richard's office trying to prepare himself for what might be waiting. What news could be important enough to require a meeting but not urgent enough to share over the phone? Richard's office was familiar, the place where Michael had planned his divorce strategy years ago, and sitting in the conference room brought back memories Michael had worked hard to leave behind, brought back the anger and hurt and betrayal he had processed, and mostly released, and he didn't like feeling those emotions again even faintly. Richard came in carrying a file and looking uncomfortable, and he sat down across from Michael and took a breath and explained that he had been contacted by a lawyer representing Victoria's estate, which confused Michael until Richard clarified that Victoria had died 3 weeks ago, had been found in her mother's apartment where she had been living, and the death was apparently from an overdose of sleeping pills combined with alcohol, ruled officially as accidental, but everyone involved suspected it was suicide. Michael felt like he had been punched, felt all the air leave his lungs, and his brain struggled to process what Richard was saying, because whatever he had expected this meeting to be about, it wasn't this. Wasn't Victoria being dead, wasn't her story ending this way, and despite everything she had done to him, despite all the pain and betrayal, he had never wished this for her, had never wanted her to be so broken that death seemed like the better option. Richard continued explaining that Victoria's lawyer had contacted him because Victoria's will left everything she owned to Michael, which wasn't at much, just some personal belongings and a life insurance policy with a $50,000 payout, but the lawyer said Victoria had left a letter for Michael as well, a letter that had been written shortly before her death, and the lawyer wanted to know if Michael wanted to receive it or if he preferred to decline, to let Victoria's last words remain unread, to maintain the distance and closure he had achieved. Michael sat in stunned silence, trying to process this information, trying to understand what he felt, and he realized he felt grief, genuine grief for Victoria despite everything, grief for the waste of potential and the tragedy of how her life had ended, grief for the woman she might have been if Harrison had never targeted her, if she had made different choices, if circumstances had been different, and beneath the grief was guilt, irrational guilt that whispered, maybe if he had forgiven her, maybe if he had helped her, maybe if he had been different, this wouldn't have happened, even though his rational mind knew that wasn't true, knew he wasn't responsible for Victoria's choices or her outcomes, knew he had protected himself appropriately. He told Richard he wanted the letter, wanted to know what Victoria had written, wanted whatever final communication she had intended for him, and Richard pulled an envelope from the file and handed it across the table, and Michael held it, feeling the weight of words he hadn't read yet. Words from beyond death, a voice from someone who no longer existed. Michael didn't read the letter in Richard's office, took it home and waited until evening when Elena was at a dinner meeting with investors. Needing to be alone for this, needing space to feel whatever he was going to feel without worrying about how it affected anyone else. He poured himself a drink and sat in his study and opened the envelope with hands that shook slightly, and he pulled out several handwritten pages in Victoria's distinctive script, and he began to read words that would haunt him in different ways than her betrayal had haunted him, words that were raw and honest and painful in their clarity. Victoria wrote that she was writing this letter because she wanted him to know what happened, wanted him to understand the full story even though she knew it changed nothing, wanted him to have truth even if it was too late to matter, and she apologized for everything, for the humiliation and the theft and the betrayal, for not being strong enough to resist Harrison's manipulation, for being so desperate for validation and status that she convinced herself Michael wasn't enough, that she deserved something better, that she could have the life Harrison promised, and she wrote that losing Michael was the worst consequence of her choices, worse than losing her career, or her reputation, or her money, because Michael had been real and Harrison had been fake. Michael had loved her genuinely and Harrison had used her cynically, and she hadn't understood the difference until it was too late. Victoria's letter continued with details about what happened after the divorce, how Harrison had taken the $7 million she paid Michael and had convinced her to invest it in ventures that didn't exist, how he had abandoned her once the money was gone, how she had tried to rebuild her life and Her career, but the scandal had made her unhireable, how she had applied to hundreds of positions and been rejected by all of them, how she had ended up living with her mother in a small apartment working retail jobs that barely paid rent, how she had fallen into depression and addiction, how every day felt like punishment for what she had done to Michael, how she couldn't escape the guilt and the regret and the knowledge that she had destroyed her own life and hurt someone who didn't deserve it. She wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness and didn't want pity, wrote that she was accepting responsibility for her choices even while acknowledging Harrison's manipulation, wrote that she had loved Michael even though she had loved him poorly, had loved him even while betraying him, had loved him in the way that a broken person loves, which is inadequately and selfishly but still genuinely, and she hoped he had found happiness with someone better than her, someone who appreciated what he offered and didn't take him for granted, someone who deserved him in ways she never had. The letter ended with Victoria writing that she was tired, so tired of fighting and failing and carrying shame, tired of being the person she had become, tired of living in the wreckage of her own choices, and, while she didn't explicitly say she was planning to kill herself, the implications were clear. The tone was one of goodbye, of someone preparing to exit. And Michael read those final lines with tears streaming down his face, crying for Victoria and for himself, and for the waste of it all, for how different things could have been if different choices had been made. Elena came home and found Michael in his study holding Victoria's letter with tears drying on his face, and she didn't ask questions, just held him while he told her what had happened, told her about Victoria's death and the letter, and the guilt he felt even though he knew intellectually it wasn't his fault. And Elena listened and comforted and reassured him that he had done nothing wrong, that he had protected himself appropriately, that Victoria's choices were her own and her consequences were hers to bear, that tragedy didn't make the betrayal acceptable or mean he should have responded differently. They talked late into the night about Victoria and about trauma and about how complicated grief could be when it involved someone who hurt you, and Michael felt grateful for Elena's presence, grateful for her understanding, grateful that he had someone to share this with who didn't judge him for his complicated emotions. He decided to attend Victoria's funeral, not because he owed her anything, but because he needed closure, needed to see this chapter fully ended, needed to say goodbye to the woman he had loved and the marriage that had failed, and the pain that had defined several years of his life. Elena offered again to come with him, but Michael declined, said this was something he needed to do alone, and she understood and supported his decision without making him explain further. Chapter 13. Victoria's funeral was held on a gray Thursday morning at a small chapel, attended by perhaps 30 people, mostly family and a few friends who had stuck with her through her decline, and Michael arrived late deliberately, slipping into the back row and observing rather than participating, not wanting to draw attention or make the day about him when it was supposed to be about Victoria. The casket was closed, which Michael was grateful for because he didn't want his last image of Victoria to be her dead, wanted to remember her as she had been, in the good times, even if those good times had been built on lies, and the service was simple and sad, with Victoria's mother speaking about her daughter with a voice that shook and tears that didn't stop, talking about Victoria's potential, and her dreams and how life had been cruel to her. And Michael felt his throat tighten listening to a mother grieve her child, felt the universal tragedy of a parent outliving their kid regardless of what mistakes that kid had made. Several people spoke, sharing memories of Victoria from different periods of her life, and Michael learned things he hadn't known, learned that she had volunteered at legal aid clinics in law school, learned that she had helped an elderly neighbor with legal paperwork for free, learned that there had been goodness in her even if it had been overcome by ambition and manipulation. And these glimpses of a Victoria he hadn't fully known made his grief more complex, made him more not just the relationship, but the person, the full complicated human who had been capable of both kindness and cruelty. After the service, as people were leaving for the cemetery, Victoria's mother approached Michael, and he braced himself for anger or blame or accusations that he had contributed to Victoria's downfall, but instead she hugged him, held him tight and cried into his shoulder and thanked him for coming, thanked him for the years he gave Victoria, thanked him for loving her daughter. Even if it ended badly, and she said she didn't blame him for anything, that she knew Victoria had made terrible choices, that she had tried to help but Victoria wouldn't accept help, wouldn't admit she needed it, and she said she was sorry for what Victoria did to him, sorry he had been hurt by her daughter's selfishness, sorry that his kindness had been repaid with betrayal. Michael found himself crying too, crying with this woman who had lost her child, sharing grief that was different, but somehow connected, and he told Victoria's mother that he was sorry too. Sorry for Victoria's pain, sorry things had ended this way, sorry that a promising young lawyer had ended up here, and they stood together, crying while other mourners walked past, two people united by their connection to someone who was gone. Victoria's mother pulled back and looked at Michael with red eyes and said Victoria had told her about the letter. Had told her she was leaving everything to Michael, including the life insurance money, and she wanted Michael to know that she thought that was right, that Victoria had taken enough from him and owed him whatever little she had left to give, and she hoped he would accept it as the apology Victoria couldn't give in person. Michael drove to the cemetery but didn't get out of his car, watched from a distance as they lowered Victoria's casket into the ground, and people dropped flowers and said final goodbyes. And he said his own goodbye from behind his windshield, whispered words into the empty car that nobody would hear but that he needed to say, told Victoria that he forgave her even though she hadn't asked for forgiveness, told her he hoped she found peace in death that she couldn't find in life, told her he was sorry he couldn't save her but he didn't regret protecting himself, told her that he would remember the good parts of their relationship and try to forget the bad, told her goodbye with finality, with closure, with the understanding that this really was the end. He drove away from the cemetery feeling lighter somehow, feeling like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted, feeling like Victoria's death had released him from something, from anger maybe, or from the possibility of future conflict, or from the small part of him that had still wondered if they could have fixed things. And now there were no more what-ifs, no more possibilities, just memory and acceptance, and the future stretching ahead without her in it. He went home to Elena and held her close and told her he loved her, told her he appreciated her, told her she had saved him in ways she probably didn't understand, and Elena said he had saved himself, had done the work and made the choices, and healed the wounds, and she was just lucky enough to be there for the result. The life insurance money arrived 6 weeks later, $50,000 paid from a policy Victoria had apparently taken out years ago when she first started at the law firm, when she was young and optimistic and probably never imagined she would die at 31 broke and alone in her mother's apartment. Michael stared at the check, trying to decide what to do with it, trying to figure out what would be appropriate, what would honor whatever complicated relationship they had shared, and he decided finally to donate it, to establish a scholarship fund in Victoria's name for first-generation law students. From low-income backgrounds, students who were like Victoria had been, ambitious, and smart, and fighting against circumstances, and maybe this money could help someone who faced the same temptations Victoria faced make different choices, could help someone build success without compromising their integrity. He worked with the law school Victoria had attended to establish the scholarship, with clear criteria and application processes, and they were grateful for the donation and honored to have the scholarship, and, when it was established, Michael felt like he had done something good. With something bad, had transformed tragedy into opportunity, had given Victoria's story a better ending than her life had, and that felt right, felt complete, felt like the final punctuation on a chapter that had been too long and too painful but was now definitively closed. Chapter 14. Years passed and Michael built a life that was stable and satisfying in ways his younger self couldn't have imagined. A life that included Elena and eventually 2 children, a daughter named Sarah and a son named David, and family changed him in fundamental ways, shifted his priorities and his perspective, and what he considered important. His businesses continued growing, but he worked less, delegated more, hired people he trusted and gave them autonomy, understanding that being present for his family mattered more than being present for every business decision, understanding that success without someone to share it with was hollow, but success shared with people you loved was fulfilling in ways money alone never could be. He and Elena bought a house in the suburbs with a big backyard and good schools nearby, nothing ostentatious but comfortable and welcoming, the kind of place where kids could run and play and make noise, where neighbors were friendly and the community was strong, and Michael found himself caring more about being a good father and husband than about being a successful entrepreneur. Though he was both, had managed to build both professional achievement and personal happiness. Michael's relationship with his parents deepened as they aged, as his father's health declined from years of hard labor at the mill and his mother's memory started failing in ways that were heartbreaking to witness, and Michael made sure they were cared for, moved them into a nice assisted living facility near his house, visited them regularly with his kids, made sure their final years were comfortable and that they knew they were loved and valued. His father died when Michael was 38, peacefully in his sleep, and at the funeral Michael spoke about a man who had taught him about dignity and work ethic and providing for family, a man who had worked himself nearly to death to give his sons opportunities he never had, and Michael said he owed everything he was to the example his father set, to the sacrifices his parents made, to the values they instilled, and he meant every word. His mother followed 2 years later, her mind mostly gone by the end, but occasionally having moments of clarity, where she recognized Michael and told him she was proud, told him he had exceeded every dream she had for him, told him he was a good man, and those final conversations were precious. To Michael, were validations that mattered more than any business success or financial milestone. As Michael entered his 40s, he found himself thinking more about legacy and impact and what he wanted his life to mean beyond accumulating wealth, and he started shifting his focus toward philanthropy and community investment, toward using his resources to create opportunities for others the way opportunities had been created for him, or more accurately, the way he had fought to create opportunities for himself. He established a foundation that provided small business grants to entrepreneurs from low-income backgrounds, particularly focusing on people who had been rejected by traditional lenders, people who had ideas and work ethic and commitment but lacked capital and connections, and the foundation funded dozens of small businesses over the years, some that succeeded and some that failed, but all of which gave people chances they wouldn't have had otherwise. Michael personally mentored several of the grant recipients, shared what he had learned about business and real estate and investing, and found this work more satisfying than his own business ventures had been. Found that helping others succeed was more fulfilling than his own success. Found that being the person who believed in someone when nobody else did was a gift he could give that mattered in ways money alone couldn't capture. Elena encouraged Michael's philanthropic work, was involved in the foundation herself, and together they built something that was theirs in a different way than their marriage or their family was theirs, built something that would outlast them, that would continue helping people long after they were gone, and Michael liked that idea, liked the thought that his life would have meaning that extended beyond his own existence, that kids in the future who were like he had been would have chances because he had been fortunate enough to build wealth and wise enough to share it. He thought sometimes about Victoria, wondered what she would think seeing what his life had become, wondered if she would regret her choices even more knowing what she had given up, but mostly he didn't think about her, had integrated her into his story without letting her define his story, had learned from the experience without being paralyzed by it, had loved again and trusted again and built again, proving that betrayal didn't have to be permanent damage, that healing was possible, that people were more resilient than they believed until resilience was required. The scholarship fund in Victoria's name continued supporting students, and occasionally Michael would receive letters from recipients, thanking him for the opportunity, sharing how the money had made education possible, and he would read those letters and feel like something good had come from something bad, like Victoria's mistakes had been transformed into someone else's chances. And that felt like redemption of a sort, not for Victoria perhaps, but for the situation, for the pain that had been inflicted. Chapter 15. When Michael was 45 years old, his daughter Sarah was applying to colleges and stressing about essays and recommendations and whether she would get in anywhere good, and one evening she asked Michael for advice about her personal statement, asked what made someone stand out, what made a story compelling, and Michael found himself telling her about his own story, about growing up poor in Millbrook and collecting cans and mowing lawns and building businesses about his marriage. To Victoria and the betrayal and the revenge and the lessons learned, sharing it all with a candor he rarely used, and Sarah listened with wide eyes, having known pieces of the story but never the full narrative, never understanding the full scope of what her father had experienced and overcome. When he finished, Sarah was quiet for a long time, and then she asked a question that stopped Michael cold. Dad, do you think you would have been happy if Victoria had never betrayed you, if you had stayed married to her? Michael's automatic response was yes, of course, but as he actually considered the question, he realized the answer was more complicated, realized that his marriage to Victoria had been built on illusions and would have eventually collapsed regardless, realized that staying with Victoria would have meant never meeting Elena, never having Sarah and David as they existed, never building the life he actually had. And he told Sarah honestly that no, he wouldn't have been happy long-term with Victoria because they weren't actually compatible even. Before the betrayal, they had been playing roles instead of being themselves, and the betrayal had been terrible, but it had also been liberating, had freed him to find something real. Sarah asked why Michael had given Victoria so much money for the law firm if he didn't really know her, why he had trusted her with millions of dollars, and Michael explained. That love makes you stupid sometimes. Makes you see what you want to see instead of what's actually there, makes you ignore warning signs and rationalize concerns, and he told Sarah that the lesson wasn't to never trust anyone but to trust carefully, to verify, to watch how people behaved over time rather than just listening to what they said, to understand that real partners wanted to build together rather than take from you, and real love empowered both people rather than diminishing one to elevate the other. He told Sarah about Elena, about how their relationship had been different from the beginning, about how Elena had insisted on independence and equality, about how she had proven her character through years of consistent behavior before marriage was ever discussed, and he said that was the model Sarah should look for eventually, someone who wanted her for who she was, rather than what she could provide, someone whose actions matched their words, someone who made her life better without requiring her to make herself smaller. Sarah listened thoughtfully, and then said something that surprised Michael. She said she was glad the Victoria situation happened because it led to her and David existing, led to their family being what it was, and she couldn't imagine any alternative that would be better than the life they had. So while she was sorry Michael was hurt, she was grateful for the outcome, and Michael realized his daughter was right, that tragedy had led to blessing, that the worst thing that happened to him had ultimately created space for the best things. That conversation with Sarah made Michael reflect on his entire journey, made him think about the kid collecting cans, and the young man flipping furniture, and the investor building wealth, and the husband betrayed, and the man who rebuilt, and he realized that every stage had been necessary, that every failure and success had taught him something, that even Victoria's betrayal had served a purpose in his development, had taught him about resilience and boundaries and the importance of choosing carefully, had forced him to become someone stronger and wiser than he would have been without that pain. He thought about the test-run husband comment that had launched everything. Thought about standing at that law firm opening party feeling humiliated and small, and he realized that moment had been a gift in disguise, had shown him truth he needed to see even though seeing it was agonizing, had given him information that allowed him to protect himself and rebuild, and without that public humiliation he might have stayed in a bad marriage for years, might have continued investing in someone who was stealing from him, might have wasted decades before discovering the truth. The realization didn't make the betrayal hurt less in retrospect, but it gave it meaning, gave it purpose, transformed it from pure tragedy into a difficult teacher, and Michael decided that was how he would remember that entire period, as the time when he learned the hardest lessons. The ones that shaped him most fundamentally, the ones that made everything else possible. Michael started sharing his story more openly, accepting speaking invitations at entrepreneurship conferences and business schools, talking honestly about success and failure and betrayal and recovery, and he found that audiences connected with the vulnerability, connected with the admission that he had been fooled and hurt and had made mistakes, that success wasn't a straight line, but a messy path full of detours and setbacks and painful lessons. Young entrepreneurs would approach him after speeches asking for advice, asking how to protect themselves, asking how to know who to trust, and Michael would tell them there were no guarantees, that trust always involved risk, that the goal wasn't to avoid risk but to take calculated risks, to protect yourself without becoming so cynical you missed legitimate opportunities and genuine people. He would tell them to trust their instincts, to pay attention when something felt wrong even if they couldn't articulate why, to understand that people showed you who they were through actions, not words, and to remember that business was business even with family and friends, that protecting yourself legally and financially wasn't insulting but prudent, that people who truly cared about you would understand boundaries and respect them. Some people criticized Michael for sharing the Victoria story publicly, said he was exploiting her death or violating her privacy or making himself seem like a victim, but Michael didn't care about those criticisms because he knew his intentions were good, knew the story had value for others, knew that sharing it openly was part of his healing process and maybe part of hers posthumously, giving her mistakes meaning by turning them into lessons for others. Chapter 16. When Michael was 48 years old, he received a letter from a young man named Marcus Thompson, a recipient of one of his foundation's business grants, and Marcus wrote that he wanted to meet Michael in person, wanted to thank him properly, wanted to show Michael what the grant had made possible. Michael agreed to meet at Marcus's business, a small manufacturing company that made custom furniture, and when Michael walked into the workshop he felt like he had stepped into a memory, seeing the tools and the sawdust and the partially finished pieces, remembering his own days flipping furniture in a rented garage, remembering how he had started with nothing and built something through work and determination, and he felt a connection to Marcus immediately, felt like he was looking at a younger version of himself. Marcus gave Michael a tour showing the operation he had built, explaining that the grant had allowed him to buy equipment and rent the space, and hire his first employee, and now 2 years later he had 6 employees, and steady business, and was even beginning to profit, and he said, without Michael's foundation none of it would have been possible, that banks had rejected him because of his background and his lack of collateral, that he had been about to give up when the grant came through, and Michael's belief in him had given him the confidence to believe in himself. Marcus asked about Michael's story, asked how he had built his wealth and his businesses, and Michael told him the abbreviated version, hitting the major points without dwelling on the painful parts, and when he mentioned the law firm opening party and the test-run husband comment, Marcus stopped him and asked him to explain more, said something about that moment resonated with him, and Michael shared the full story, shared the humiliation and the revenge and the consequences, and the eventual healing, and Marcus listened intently and then said something Michael hadn't expected. He said his own girlfriend had recently pressured him to give her money from the business, had said if he really loved her he would make her a partner, had gotten angry when he refused, and he had been wondering if he was being selfish or controlling. But hearing Michael's story made him realize he was actually being wise, was protecting what he built, was maintaining appropriate boundaries. And he thanked Michael not just for the grant, but for the cautionary tale that helped him avoid a potentially disastrous mistake. Michael felt the full circle nature of that moment, felt how his pain had become someone else's protection, how his lesson had become someone else's wisdom, and he understood finally why he had been through what he had been through, understood that his experiences had purpose beyond his own growth, had value that extended to others who could learn from his mistakes and his successes. Michael and Marcus stayed in touch after that meeting, developed a mentorship relationship that eventually became a friendship, and Michael watched Marcus's business grow and thrive, watched him make smart decisions and avoid pitfalls, watched him build something sustainable and successful, and Michael felt pride that wasn't about his own achievement but about enabling someone else's achievement, about being a small part of someone else's success story. Marcus eventually hired a young woman from a background similar to his own, giving her a chance nobody else would, and when Michael asked about it, Marcus said he was paying forward what Michael had paid forward, was being for someone else what Michael had been for him, and the chain continued, the ripple effects of one grant spreading out in ways Michael hadn't anticipated, but deeply appreciated. This was legacy, Michael realized, not buildings with your name on them or bank accounts passed to children, but changes in people's lives that then changed other people's lives, effects that cascaded forward through time, impact, measured in opportunities created, and people helped and potential unlocked, and he understood that his life's meaning wasn't in how much he accumulated but in how much he gave away, how much he shared, how much he enabled others. Michael's children grew up and pursued their own paths, Sarah becoming a teacher working with underprivileged kids and David becoming a lawyer doing civil rights work, and both chose careers that prioritized service over money, that focused on helping others rather than enriching themselves, and Michael felt proud that his kids had learned the right lessons, had understood that wealth was a tool not a goal, that success meant making a positive difference not just accumulating possessions, and he knew their values came partly from how he and Elena had raised them, from the example they set, and the conversations they had, and the priorities they demonstrated. When Sarah told him she was turning down a higher-paying job at a private school to work in a public school in a low-income neighborhood, Michael hugged her and told her he was proud, told her she was choosing the harder path that would matter more. And Sarah said she learned from watching him that the point of success was to help others succeed, that having advantages meant creating advantages for those without them. And Michael realized his kids had internalized the lessons that had taken him decades to learn, would start their adult lives with wisdom he had paid dearly to acquire, and that was perhaps the best inheritance he could give them. Chapter 17. Now in his 50s, financially secure beyond anything he had imagined possible, with a family he loved and a legacy he was proud of, Michael found himself thinking often about his journey, about the path from Millbrook to here, from collecting cans to philanthropist, from poor kid to successful entrepreneur, from devastated divorce to happily remarried father, and he marveled at how it all connected, how every piece had been necessary to create the whole, how nothing had been wasted even if much had been painful. He thought about the law firm opening party that had changed everything, thought about standing in that doorway hearing test-run husband and feeling his world collapse, and he realized that moment had been a gift, had been the beginning of his real life even though it had felt like an ending, had forced him to find strength he didn't know he possessed, had cleared away something false to make room for something real, and he wouldn't change it even if he could, because changing it would mean changing everything that came after, would mean losing Elena and Sarah and David, would mean becoming a different person than who he was, and he liked who he was, liked the man he had become through struggle and healing and rebuilding. Michael visited Millbrook occasionally, driving through the town where he grew up, seeing the same smokestacks and the same worn houses, remembering the kid he had been who swore he would escape, who promised himself he would be different, who believed with absolute certainty that he was destined for more, and he felt gratitude for that kid's determination, felt grateful that his younger self hadn't given up despite obstacles and setbacks and circumstances that could have crushed him. He drove past his childhood home, now occupied by another struggling family, and he remembered winter nights when the heat barely worked and summer days when the kitchen was sweltering, remembered his parents working multiple jobs and still barely making it, remembered collecting cans and mowing lawns and doing whatever it took to earn a few dollars, and he felt proud of where he came from, proud of the lessons poverty taught him, proud that he had broken the cycle and created opportunities his parents never had. He stopped at the cemetery where his parents were buried, stood at their graves and told them about his life, told them about their grandchildren, and the businesses he built and the people he helped, told them he had done it, had achieved the success he promised, had made something of himself, and he felt their pride even though they were gone, felt their presence in his values and his work ethic and his determination, understood that they lived on through him and through his children, that their sacrifices had compound interest that would echo through generations. Elena asked Michael once if he ever regretted how his life unfolded, if he wished he had made different choices or avoided certain pain, and Michael answered without hesitation that he regretted nothing, that every choice had taught him something, that every pain had made him stronger or wiser or more compassionate, that the person he was couldn't exist without the experiences he had, both good and bad, both joyful and agonizing, and he wouldn't trade any of it. He told Elena that the worst day of his life, that day at the law firm opening party, had ultimately led to the best things in his life, had led to her and their children, and the life they built together, had led to him becoming someone capable of real love, instead of someone who settled for performance, and the price had been worth paying, even though paying it had been excruciating. Elena said she was grateful for Victoria in a strange way. Grateful that Victoria's betrayal had freed Michael to eventually find her. Grateful that the first marriage ended because it meant the second marriage could begin, and while she felt sorry for Victoria's tragic end, she also felt grateful for her own happiness, and she didn't think those two feelings contradicted each other, thought it was possible to have compassion for Victoria, while also being glad things worked out differently. Michael agreed, said he had forgiven Victoria years ago, had released the anger and the resentment and the desire for revenge, had found peace with what happened and who she was and how it all ended, and forgiveness hadn't meant forgetting or excusing but simply accepting and moving forward without carrying poison. Chapter 18. As Michael approached 60, he began the process of transitioning his businesses to the next generation, selling some ventures and giving others to his kids, or to longtime employees who had helped build them, keeping enough involvement to stay engaged but not so much that he couldn't enjoy the time he had left, understanding that life was finite and he wanted to spend his remaining years focused on what mattered most, rather than chasing more success that he didn't need. He and Elena traveled, visited places they had talked about for years but never made time to see, and they discovered that they enjoyed each other's company even more after decades of marriage, had built a friendship that transcended romance, had become genuine partners in the deepest sense, and Michael felt grateful every day that he had found this. After losing what he thought he wanted, felt grateful that life had given him a second chance to get love right. They spent time with their grandchildren, Sarah having 2 kids and David having 1, and Michael loved being a grandfather. Loved the role of wise elder who could spoil kids and tell stories and offer guidance without the daily responsibility of parenting, and he made sure to tell his grandchildren about where they came from, about the family's humble origins, about the importance of hard work and integrity and helping others, wanting to instill values that would carry forward. The foundation Michael had started continued growing, now managing tens of millions of dollars in assets and providing hundreds of grants and scholarships annually, and Michael took pride in the organization's independence and sustainability, knowing it would continue long after he was gone, knowing his impact would extend far beyond his lifetime, knowing that kids not yet born would someday receive opportunities because he had decided to share what he built. He established an endowment for the scholarship in Victoria's name, ensuring it would continue perpetually, and he added a requirement that recipients write an essay about learning from mistakes and second chances, wanting Victoria's legacy to be about redemption and growth, wanting her story to help others even though her life ended tragically. Michael sometimes wondered if Victoria would have approved, if she would have wanted her name associated with his foundation, but he decided that she had given him permission through her final letter, had left him everything including the right to memorialize her as he saw fit, and he chose to remember her potential, rather than her failures, chose to honor the woman she might have been, rather than the woman she became. On his 60th birthday, Michael's family threw him a party at his house, nothing elaborate, just the people he loved gathered together, and after dinner Sarah asked Michael to share advice for living a good life, asked him what he had learned in 6 decades that was worth passing on, and Michael thought carefully before answering, wanting to give them something meaningful, something earned through experience rather than just platitudes. He told them that life would hurt them, would betray them, would knock them down in ways they couldn't anticipate, and the measure of their character would be how they responded, whether they stayed down or got back up, whether they became bitter or became wiser, whether they let pain define them or refine them. He told them that success mattered less than significance, that money could solve problems but couldn't create purpose, that the people they loved and the values they held and the impact they made were what actually mattered when everything else was stripped away. He told them to trust carefully but to trust completely once trust was earned, to protect themselves without becoming cynical, to remember that most people were good even though some people weren't, to give second chances but not third chances, to forgive without forgetting, to except that they couldn't control what happened to them, but could control how they responded. He told them that betrayal and failure and loss were guaranteed, but so were recovery, and growth and new opportunities, that endings made space for beginnings, that nothing was wasted if they learned from it, that their lives would be complicated, and messy and beautiful and painful and worth it. All of it worth it. Michael's grandchildren asked him what his greatest achievement was. And without hesitation he said it was them, was his family, was. Knowing that he had raised kids who were good people and who were raising their own good people, was understanding that his values and his lessons would live on through generations, was seeing that he had broken cycles of poverty and struggle, and had created new cycles of opportunity and generosity, and nothing he built with money compared to what he built with love and intention and presence. He told them about the test-run husband moment, about the worst day of his life when his wife divorced him at her law firm opening party, and he told them how he responded, how he pulled his investment and canceled payments, and walked away, and how that moment of strength had saved him, had taught him his own worth, had shown him that he didn't need anyone who didn't value him, and he hoped they would remember that lesson, would know their worth, and would walk away from anyone who diminished it, would have the courage to protect themselves even when protection required pain. The story captivated his family as it always did, the dramatic tale of betrayal and revenge and redemption, and Michael saw his grandchildren's eyes widen at the parts about canceling millions of dollars and receiving hundreds of missed calls, and he knew they were too young to fully understand, but someday they would. Someday they would face their own betrayals and would remember. Their grandfather walked away with dignity and rebuilt with determination, and maybe that memory would give them strength. Chapter 19. Elena asked Michael one quiet evening years after that 60th birthday party whether he ever wished he could talk to Victoria one more time, whether there were things left unsaid or questions left unanswered, and Michael thought about it and realized that he had achieved complete closure, that Victoria's letter had answered what needed answering, that her death had ended what needed ending, and he felt no need to communicate further with her memory or her ghost or whatever might remain. He told Elena that the conversation he needed to have with Victoria had actually been a conversation with himself, a process of understanding what he had ignored and why he had ignored it, a reckoning with his own role in staying with someone who was wrong for him, and he had completed that conversation years ago in therapy and through reflection and through building something better. He said that Victoria's biggest gift to him, unintentional though it was, had been forcing him to examine himself, to understand his patterns and his weaknesses and his blind spots, to recognize that he had been so focused on providing and achieving that he hadn't paid attention to partnership quality, had measured his marriage by external metrics, like success and appearance, rather than internal metrics like respect and compatibility and genuine connection. Michael realized that he had been complicit in the failure of his first marriage, not in causing Victoria's betrayal, but in ignoring signs that they weren't right for each other, in prioritizing the idea of being married over the reality of who he was married to, in wanting success so badly that he tried to force a relationship that was fundamentally flawed into the shape he needed. He didn't blame himself for Victoria's choices, and he didn't excuse her behavior, but he acknowledged his own role, in staying when he should have left, in investing when he should have questioned, in trusting blindly when he should have verified, and this acknowledgement was important because it gave him agency, turned him from pure victim into someone who had made mistakes and learned from them, someone who had grown and changed and become wiser. Elena appreciated his self-awareness, said it was one of the things she loved most about him, his willingness to examine himself honestly and take responsibility for his part in his own story, and she said that capacity for reflection was rare and valuable, and had made their marriage stronger because he didn't repeat patterns, didn't bring unexamined wounds into their relationship, had done the work of healing before asking her to build with him. Michael thought about the concept of the test-run husband comment that had started everything, thought about the cruelty of that phrase, but also the unintentional accuracy, and he realized that in a strange way Victoria had been right. Their marriage had been a test run, had been a learning experience that prepared him for the real thing, had taught him what love wasn't, so he could recognize what love was when it appeared in the form of Elena. He hadn't been Victoria's test-run husband in the way she meant, as someone disposable and temporary and beneath her, but he had been test-running marriage, test-running partnership, learning what worked and what didn't, figuring out who he was in relationship and what he needed and what he couldn't tolerate, and all of that preparation had made his second marriage successful in ways his first marriage never could have been. This realization transformed the insult into something almost useful, turned the source of his deepest humiliation into a source of unexpected insight. And Michael appreciated the irony, appreciated that Victoria's cruelty had contained an accidental truth that actually helped him in the long run, and he decided that was the final lesson from that entire experience, that even the worst moments could contain useful information if you were willing to look for it, that nothing was completely wasted, that wisdom could be found in the wound if you examined it carefully enough. Michael wrote extensively in a journal during his early 60s, trying to capture his experiences and his lessons for his children and grandchildren, wanting to leave behind more than money and property, wanting to leave behind understanding and perspective and hard-won wisdom. He wrote about growing up poor and the fire that poverty lit in him, about building businesses and making money and learning that wealth was a tool not a destination, about falling in love and being betrayed and discovering that you could survive what you thought would destroy you, about healing and rebuilding and finding real partnership, about raising kids and building legacy and understanding what actually mattered. And he wrote honestly about his mistakes and his regrets and his triumphs and his gratitude, wanting his descendants to see him as fully human, as someone who struggled and failed and succeeded and grew, someone they could learn from precisely because he had been flawed and imperfect and willing to admit it. He wrote specifically about the Victoria situation with more nuance than he had ever shared publicly, acknowledging his own failings and her humanity despite her betrayal, trying to capture the complexity of what happened without villainizing anyone completely, and he hoped that someday his grandchildren would read these. Thanks for watching. Take care. Good luck.